Chilling tales for dark nights.
Want to make sure you never miss a Chilling Tales for Dark Nights video again? Be sure to subscribe and hit that bell to turn on notifications.
The Monkey's Paw by W. W. Jacobs. Narrated by Peter Bishop. 1. Without, the night was cold and wet, but in the small parlour of Laburnum Villa, the blinds were drawn and the fire burned brightly. Father and son were at chess. The former, who possessed ideas about the game involving radical changes, putting his king in such sharp and unnecessary perils that it even provoked comment from the white-haired old lady knitting placidly by the fire.
"Hark at that wind,"
said Mr. White, who, having seen a fatal mistake after it was too late, was amiably desirous of preventing his son from seeing it.
"I'm listening,"
said the latter, grimly surveying the board as he stretched out his hand.
"Check,"
"I should hardly think he'd come tonight,"
said his father, with his hand poised over the board.
"Mate,"
replied the son.
"That's the worst of living so far out,"
bawled Mr. White, with sudden and unlooked-for violence.
"Of all the beastly, slushy, out-of-the-way places to live in, this is the worst. Pathway's a bog and the road's a torrent. I don't know what people are thinking about. I suppose because only 2 houses in the road are let, they think it doesn't matter."
"Never mind, dear.
said his wife soothingly.
Perhaps you'll win the next one."
Mr. White looked up sharply, just in time to intercept a knowing glance between mother and son. The words died away on his lips, and he hid a guilty grin in his thin grey beard.
"There he is,"
said Herbert White, as the gate banged to loudly and heavy footsteps came toward the door. The old man rose with hospitable haste and, opening the door, was heard condoling with the new arrival. The new arrival also condoled with himself, so that Mrs. White said,
"Tut-tut,"
and coughed gently as her husband entered the room, followed by a tall, burly man, beady of eye and rubicund of visage.
"Sergeant Major Morris,"
he said, introducing him. The Sergeant Major shook hands and, taking the proffered seat by the fire, watched contentedly while his host got out whiskey and tumblers and stood a small copper kettle on the fire. At the third glass, his eyes got brighter and he began to talk, the little family circle regarding with eager interest this visitor from distant parts as he squared his broad shoulders in the chair and spoke of the wild scenes and doughty deeds, of wars and plagues and strange peoples.
21 years of it,
said Mr. White, nodding at his wife and son.
When he went away, he was a slip of a youth in the warehouse. Now look at him.
"He don't look to have taken much harm,"
said Mrs. White politely.
"I'd like to go to India myself,"
said the old man.
"Just to look around a bit, you know."
"Better where you are,"
said the Sergeant Major, shaking his head. He put down the empty glass and, sighing softly, shook it again.
"I should like to see those old temples and fakirs and jugglers,"
said the old man.
"What was that you started telling me the other day about a monkey's paw or something, Morris?"
"Nothing.
said the soldier hastily.
Leastways, nothing worth hearing."
"Monkey's paw?"
said Mrs. White, curiously.
"Well, it's just a bit of what you might call magic, perhaps,"
said the Sergeant Major offhandedly. His 3 listeners leaned forward eagerly. The visitor absent-mindedly put his empty glass to his lips and then set it down again. His host filled it for him.
To look at it.
said the Sergeant Major, fumbling in his pocket.
It's just an ordinary little paw dried to a mummy.
He took something out of his pocket and proffered it. Mrs. White drew back with a grimace, but her son, taking it, examined it curiously. "And what is there special about it?" inquired Mr. White as he took it from his son, and having examined it, placed it upon the table.
It had a spell put on it by an old fakir,
said the Sergeant Major.
a very holy man. He wanted to show that fate ruled people's lives and that those who interfered with it did so to their sorrow. He put a spell on it so that 3 separate men could each have 3 wishes from it.
His manner was so impressive that his hearers were conscious that their light laughter jarred somewhat.
Well, why don't you have 3, sir?
Said Herbert White cleverly. The soldier regarded him in the way that middle age is wont to regard presumptuous youth.
I have,
he said quietly, and his blotchy face whitened.
And did you really have the 3 wishes granted?
Asked Mrs. White.
I did,
said the Sergeant Major, and his glass tapped against his strong teeth.
And has anybody else wished?
Persisted the old lady.
The first man had his 3 wishes, yes?
Was the reply.
I don't know what the first 2 were, but the third was for death. That's how I got the paw.
His tones were so grave that a hush fell upon the group.
If you've had your 3 wishes, it's no good to you now then, Morris,
said the old man at last.
What'd you keep it for?
The soldier shook his head.
Fancy, I suppose,
he said slowly.
I did have some idea of selling it, but I don't think I will. It has caused enough mischief already. Besides, people won't buy. They think it's a fairy tale, some of them. And those who do think anything of it want to try it first and pay me afterward.
If you could have another 3 wishes,
said the old man, eyeing him keenly.
Would you have them?
I don't know,
said the other.
I don't know.
He took the paw and, dangling it between his forefinger and thumb, suddenly threw it upon the fire. White, with a sudden cry, stooped down and snatched it off.
Better let it burn,
said the soldier solemnly.
If you don't want it, Morris,
said the other.
Give it to me.
I won't,
said his friend doggedly.
I threw it on the fire. If you keep it, don't blame me for what happens. Pitch it on the fire again like a sensible man.
The other shook his head and examined his new possession closely.
How do you do it?
He inquired.
Hold it up in your right hand and wish aloud,
said the Sergeant Major.
But I warn you of the consequences.
Sounds like the Arabian Nights,
said Mrs. White as she rose and began to set the supper.
Don't you think you might wish for 4 pairs of hands for me?
Her husband drew the talisman from pocket, and then all 3 burst into laughter as the Sergeant Major, with a look of alarm on his face, caught him by the arm.
If you must wish,
he said gruffly,
wish for something sensible.
Mr. White dropped it back in his pocket and, placing chairs, motioned his friend to the table. In the business of supper, the talisman was partly forgotten, and afterward the 3 sat listening in an enthralled fashion to a second installment of the soldier's adventures in India.
If the tale about the monkey's paw is not more truthful than those he has been telling us,
said Herbert as the door closed behind their guest, just in time for him to catch the last train,
we shan't make much out of it.
Did you give him anything for it, Father?
inquired Mrs. White, regarding her husband closely.
A trifle,
he said, colouring slightly.
He didn't want it, but I made him take it. And he pressed me again to throw it away.
Likely,
said Herbert with pretend horror.
Why, we're going to be rich and famous and happy. Wish to be an emperor, father, to begin with. Then you can't be henpecked.
He darted round the table, pursued by the maligned Mrs. White, armed with an antimacassar. Mr. White took the paw from his pocket and eyed it dubiously.
I don't know what to wish for, and that's a fact.
He said slowly.
It seems to me I've got all I want.
If you only cleared that house, you'd be quite happy, wouldn't you?
Said Herbert, with his hand on his shoulder.
Well, wish for £200 then. That'll just do it.
His father, smiling shamefacedly at his own credulity, held up the talisman, and his son, with a solemn face somewhat marred by a wink at his mother, sat down at the piano and struck a few impressive chords.
I wish for £200,
said the old man distinctly. A fine crash from the piano greeted the words, interrupted by a shuddering cry from the old man. His wife and son ran toward him.
It moved!
He cried, with a glance of disgust at the object as it lay on the floor.
As I wished, it twisted in my hand like a snake.
Well, I don't see the money.
Said his son as he picked it up and placed it on the table.
And I bet I never shall.
It must have been your fancy, Father,
said his wife, regarding him anxiously. He shook his head.
Never mind, though, there's no harm done. It gave me a shock all the same.
They sat down by the fire again while the two men finished their pipes. Outside, the wind was higher than ever, and the old man started nervously at the sound of a door banging upstairs. A silence unusual and depressing settled upon all three, which lasted until the old couple rose to retire for the night.
I expect you'll find the cash tied up in a big bag in the middle of your bed.
Said Herbert as he bade them good night.
And something horrible squatting up on top of the wardrobe, watching you as you pocket your ill-gotten gains.
He sat alone in the darkness, gazing at the dying fire and seeing faces in it. The last face was so horrible and so simian that he gazed at it in amazement. It got so vivid that, with a little uneasy laugh, he felt on the table for a glass containing a little water to throw over it. His hand grasped the monkey's paw, and with a little shiver, he wiped his hand on his coat and went up to bed. 2. In the brightness of the wintry sun next morning as it streamed over the breakfast table, he laughed at his fears. There was an air of prosaic wholesomeness about the room which it had lacked on the previous night, and the dirty, shriveled little paw was pitched on the sideboard with a carelessness which betokened no great belief in its virtues.
I suppose all old soldiers are the same.
Said Mrs. White.
The idea of our listening to such nonsense. How could wishes be granted in these days? And if they could, how could £200 hurt you, Father?
Might drop on his head from the sky?
Said a frivolous Herbert.
Morris said that things happen so naturally.
Said his father.
That you might, if you so wished, attribute it to coincidence.
Well, don't break into the money before I come back.
Said Herbert as he rose from the table.
I'm afraid it'll turn you into a mean, avaricious man, and we shall have to disown you.
His mother laughed, and following him to the door, watched him down the road, and returning to the breakfast table, was very happy at the expense of her husband's credulity. All of which did not prevent her from scurrying to the door at the postman's knock, nor prevent her from referring somewhat shortly to retired sergeant majors of bibulous habits when she found that the post had brought a tailor's bill.
Herbert will have some more of his funny remarks, I expect, when he comes home,
She said as they sat at dinner.
I dare say.
Said Mr. White, pouring himself out some beer.
But for all that, the thing moved in my hand. That I'll swear to.
You thought it did?
said the old lady soothingly.
I say it did,
Replied the other.
There was no thought about it. It had just... What's the matter?
His wife made no reply. She was watching the mysterious movements of a man outside who, peering in an undecided fashion at the house, appeared to be trying to make up his mind to enter. In mental connection with the £200, she noticed that the stranger was well-dressed and wore a silk hat of glossy newness. 3 times he paused at the gate and then walked on again. A 4th time he stood with his hand upon it, and then with a sudden resolution flung it open and walked up the path. Mrs. White, at the same moment, placed her hands behind her and, hurriedly unfastening the strings of her apron, put that useful article of apparel beneath the cushion of her chair. She brought the stranger, who seemed ill at ease, into the room. He gazed at her furtively and listened in a preoccupied fashion as the old lady apologized for the appearance of the room and her husband's coat, a garment which he usually reserved for the garden. She then waited as patiently as her sex would permit for him to broach his business, but he was at first strangely silent.
I was asked to call.
He said at last, and stooped and picked a piece of cotton from his trousers.
I come from Ma and Meagan's.
The old lady started.
Is anything the matter?
She asked breathlessly.
Has anything happened to Herbert? What is it? What is it?
Her husband interposed.
Tell her, Mother.
He said hastily.
Sit down and don't jump to conclusions. You've not brought bad news, I'm sure, sir.
And he eyed the other wistfully.
I'm sorry,
began the visitor.
Is he hurt?
Demanded the mother wildly. The visitor bowed in assent.
Badly hurt,
He said quietly.
but he is not in any pain.
Oh, thank God.
Said the old woman, clasping her hands.
Thank God for that thing.
She broke off suddenly as the sinister meaning of the assurance dawned upon her, and she saw the awful confirmation of her fears in the other's averted face. She caught her breath, and turning to her slower-witted husband, laid her trembling old hand upon his. There was a long silence.
He was caught in the machinery.
Said the visitor at length in a low voice.
Caught in the machinery.
Repeated Mr. White in a dazed fashion.
Yes.
He sat staring blankly out at the window, and taking his wife's hand between his own, pressed it as he had been wont to do in their old courting days nearly 40 years before.
He was the only one left to us.
He said, turning gently to the visitor.
It is hard.
The other coughed and, rising, walked slowly to the window.
The firm wished me to convey their sincere sympathy with you in your great loss.
He said, without looking round.
I beg that you will understand that I am only their servant and merely obeying orders.
There was no reply. The old woman's face was white, her eyes staring, and her breath inaudible. On the husband's face was a look such as his friend the sergeant might have carried into his first action.
I was to say that Ma and Meagan's disclaim all responsibility.
Continued the other.
They admit no liability at all, but in consideration of your son's services, they wish to present you with a certain sum as compensation.
Mr. White dropped his wife's hand, and rising to his feet, gazed with a look of horror at his visitor. His dry lips shaped the words.
How much?
£200.
Was the answer. Unconscious of his wife's shriek, the old man smiled faintly, put out his hands like a sightless man, and dropped, a senseless heap, to the floor. Three. In the huge new cemetery, some 2 miles distant, the old people buried their dead and came back to a house steeped in shadow and silence. It was all over so quickly that at first they could hardly realize it, and remained in a state of expectation as though of something else to happen. Something else which was to lighten this load too heavy for old hearts to bear. But the days passed, and expectations gave place to resignation. The hopeless resignation of the old, sometimes miscalled apathy. Sometimes they hardly exchanged a word, for now they had nothing to talk about, and their days were long to weariness. It was about a week after that the old man, waking suddenly in the night, stretched out his hand and found himself alone. The room was in darkness, and the sound of subdued weeping came from the window. He raised himself in bed and listened.
Come back.
He said tenderly.
You will be cold.
It is colder for my son,
said the old woman, and wept afresh. The sound of her sobs died away on his ears. The bed was warm, and his eyes heavy with sleep. He dozed fitfully, and then slept until a sudden wild cry from his wife awoke him with a start.
The paw!
She cried wildly.
The monkey's paw!
He started up in alarm.
Where is it? What's the matter?
She came stumbling across the room toward him.
I want it.
She said quietly.
You've not destroyed it.
It's in the parlour, on the bracket.
He replied, marveling.
Why?
She cried and laughed together, and bending over, kissed his cheek.
I only just thought of it.
She said hysterically.
Why didn't I think of it before? Why didn't you think of it?
Think of what? He questioned.
The other 2 wishes.
She replied rapidly.
We've only had one.
Was that not enough?
He demanded fiercely.
No!
She cried triumphantly.
We'll have one more. Go down and get it quickly and wish our boy alive again.
The man sat up in bed and flung the bedclothes from his quaking limbs.
Good God, you are mad.
He cried, aghast.
Get it.
She panted.
Get it quickly and wish... Oh, my boy, my boy.
Her husband struck a match and lit the candle.
Get back to bed.
He said unsteadily.
You don't know what you're saying.
We had the first wish granted.
Said the old woman feverishly.
Why not the second?
Coincidence.
Stammered the old man.
Go and get it and wish.
Cried his wife, quivering with excitement. The old man turned and regarded her, and his voice shook.
He has been dead 10 days, and besides I would not tell you else, but I could only recognize him by his clothing. If he was too terrible for you to see then, how now?
Bring him back.
Cried the old woman, and dragged him toward the door.
Do you think I fear the child I have nursed?
He went down in the darkness and felt his way to the parlour, and then to the mantelpiece. The talisman was in its place, and a horrible fear that the unspoken wish might bring his mutilated son before him ere he could escape from the room seized upon him, and he caught his breath as he found that he had lost the direction of the door. His brow cold with sweat, he felt his way round the table and groping along the wall until he found himself in a small passage with the unwholesome thing in his hand. Even his wife's face seemed changed as he entered the room. It was white and expectant, and to his fears seemed to have an unnatural look upon it. He was afraid of her.
Wish!
She cried in a strong voice.
It is foolish and wicked.
He faltered.
Wish!
Repeated his wife. He raised his hand.
I wish my son alive again.
The talisman fell to the floor, and he regarded it fearfully. Then he sank trembling into a chair as the old woman, with burning eyes, walked to the window and raised the blind. He sat until he was chilled with the cold, glancing occasionally at the figure of the old woman peering through the window. The candle end, which had burned below the rim of the china candlestick, was throwing pulsating shadows on the ceiling and walls until, with a flicker larger than the rest, it expired. The old man, with an unspeakable sense of relief at the failure of the talisman, crept back to his bed, and a minute or two afterward the old woman came silently and apathetically beside him. Neither spoke, but lay silently listening to the ticking of the clock. A stair creaked, and a squeaky mouse scurried noisily through the wall. The darkness was oppressive, and after lying for some time screwing up his courage, he took the box of matches and, striking one, went downstairs for a candle. At the foot of the stairs the match went out, and he paused to strike another. And at the same moment a knock, so quiet and stealthy as to be scarcely audible, sounded on the front door. The matches fell from his hand and spilled in the passage. He stood motionless, his breath suspended until the knock was repeated. Then he turned and fled swiftly back to his room and closed the door behind him. A third knock sounded through the house.
What's that?
Cried the old woman, starting up.
A rat.
Said the old man in shaking tones.
A rat, it passed me on the stairs.
His wife sat up in bed listening. A loud knock resounded through the house.
It's Herbert! It's Herbert!
She ran to the door, but her husband was before her, and catching her by her arm, held her tightly.
What are you going to do?
He whispered hoarsely.
It's my boy! It's Herbert!
She cried, struggling mechanically.
I forgot it was 2 miles away. What are you holding me for? Let go, I must open the door.
For God's sake, don't let it in!
Cried the old man, trembling.
You're afraid of your own son.
She cried, struggling.
Let me go. I'm coming, Herbert, I'm coming.
There was another knock, and another. The old woman, with a sudden wrench, broke free and ran from the room. Her husband followed to the landing and called after her appealingly as she hurried downstairs. He heard the chain rattle back and the bottom bolt drawn slowly and stiffly from the socket. Then the old woman's voice, strained and panting.
The bolt!
She cried loudly.
Come down, I can't reach it!
But her husband was on his hands and knees groping wildly on the floor in search of the paw. If he could only find it before the thing outside got in. A perfect fusillade of knocks reverberated through the house, and he heard the scraping of a chair as his wife put it down in the passage against the door. He heard the creaking of the bolt as it came slowly back, and at the same moment he found the monkey's paw and frantically breathed his third and last wish. The knocking ceased suddenly, although the echoes of it were still in the house. He heard the chair drawn back, and the door opened. A cold wind rushed up the staircase, and a long, loud wail of disappointment and misery from his wife gave him the courage to run down to her side, and then to the gate beyond. The street lamp flickering opposite shone on a quiet and deserted road.
So I'm in the cosmetics aisle, right? And I'm standing there reading this bottle of lotion. Not tested on animals, it says. And I'm thinking, Really? Like, who the hell's rubbing lotion on animals? Anyone? A modest amount of laughter from the audience. About as much as you could expect from 12 drunk New Yorkers at 1 in the morning on a Thursday night. Nick paced the stage, the practiced, dumbfounded expression on his face, his free hands supine, his shoulders up around his ears. Laughter stops. 1, 2, 3. I mean, is that seriously the way you want to be testing your new body lotion? To rub it on a bunny? Well, the bunny doesn't seem to mind, so I guess I won't either. I mean, is this really what people think is going on? A little less laughter this time, polite at best. Not going well. Not bombing, but far from killing. Too wordy. Gotta cut it down a bit. Here comes the wordy-ass punchline. And God help you if you trip, Nick. Smooth and steady. 1, 2, 3. I mean, I picture some top-secret facility 12 floors underground, right? Armed guards, razor wire, security cameras. And inside, there's this mad scientist rubbing lubriderm on a turtle. This is what everyone's worried about? Polite laughter. Not enough. Too short. Need an extra beat before the tag. 1, 2, 3. Funny little face, shrug shoulders, sigh. Here goes. I mean, I'd love to buy this gold bond, but I have it on good authority that they rub this shit on a tilapia. Fuck! Tripped on the last goddamn word. Ruined the whole joke. Ruined the whole act. Maybe ruined his whole career for all he knew. One lady laughed, but it was clearly an act of kindness. Thanks, Mom, Nick said, and that one got the best laugh of the whole set. For an encore, he ought to pull out a gun and blow his brains out. That'd get him a standing goddamn ovation. You guys have been great, he said. Thank you. He put the microphone back in the stand and walked off stage to the bare minimum of appreciation. He took the long way around the little audience and went to sit at the bar. Danny uncapped a Heineken and touched the cold bottle to the back of his neck. Ow, he said. You're sweating, Nicky. Yeah, you'd be too, Nick said. How hard is it to say tilapia? Freaking tilapia. It's not like I chose Patagonian toothfish. Danny laughed. It was the best laugh of the night. She set the beer down in front of him. Thanks, Nick said. I'm about to kill the fryer for the night. Want anything? No thanks. Just ate my balls. You're funny as hell, Nick. Don't sweat it. What's another funny-sounding fish, Danny? Carp? Halibut? Gefilte? Danny said, winking. Christ, you're funnier than I am, Nick said. Some local greenie was up on stage doing his little Attell ripoff routine. Sadly, it was the same laughs as Nick had. You know this hack? Nick asked. Ari Green, Danny said. Short for Greenbaum, I think. Short for Greenbaum? What, with a name like Ari, you're worried about sounding too Jewish? Danny laughed. He's all right, she said. Really nice guy. It was late, but Nick decided the only way to celebrate his monumental bomb of a set was to drink about 7 or 8 beers and watch as many people bomb after him as possible. With luck, he'd get drunk enough to forget the whole thing ever happened. Ari finished his set to a smattering of polite applause and, like Nick, took the long way back to the bar. He nodded at Nick and took a seat. How you doing? Ari said. About the same as you, I suppose. I hear that. Danny around? She's closing up the kitchen. Should be back any minute. Ari nodded. What a crowd, huh? These people ought to be at an Enya concert. Nick chuckled. I'd love to blame them for my own set, but I straight up shit myself. Nah, man, Ari said. These bozos are ready for bed. That joke is killer. I've always loved that joke. Have you been here before? I didn't recognize you. I saw you at the riot room with some friends. Oh, cool, man. That's a nice room. Totally. Haven't been on stage there or anything. How long you been at this? Nick asked. 6 months. You? 5 years this May. Ari nodded. Hey, you sure Danny isn't taking a shit or something? How long does it take to get a beer around here? They keep all the beer in the back. Don't ask me why. If this was my place, I'd have 3 taps. Here, here, and here. Guinness, Bud, and Bud Light. The MC came up next with an artificial enthusiasm he hoped might wake up the audience. We've got a special treat for all you brave enough to be out past your bedtimes on a school night. Please welcome, making his comedy debut this very night at the mic stand, the magnificent Rodney Walters. Rodney Walters, everyone. He hung up the microphone and clapped enthusiastically, effectively doubling the amount of applause in the room. You heard of this guy before? Ari asked. Nick shook his head. With a name like that, I'd sure as hell remember if I did. Need anything, boys? Hi, Ari. It was Danny. Thank the gods, Ari said. Get me drunk, please. Another for you too, Nicky? Yes, ma'am. The magnificent Rodney Walters was making his way to the stage, a trundling old man in a ratty faded suit. He got to the edge of the stage and put one foot on the first step, then the second step. Then he was on stage facing the audience. Nick was sure he had never seen him. If he had, he'd have recognized the big mole on the left side of his nose. I just flew in from the local rub and tug, and boy, are Miss Ling's arms tired. Oh, God, Nick said. One of these guys. Time to go take a leak. Yeah, I'm with you. There wasn't a laugh to be had on the way to the bathroom. Rodney Walters' magnificence consisted completely of hacky one-liners, most of which you could hear variations of around any water cooler or barber shop full of dullards. It was guys like this who made people think stand-up was easy, that comedians were merely the class clown dropouts without the gumption to put in a full day's work. Guys like this who made a mockery of the craft and a shit sculpture of the art. Thanks a ton, Rodney, for your truly magnificent contribution to comedy. This one's for Rodney, Nick said, taking a leak. He could still hear the cadence of his shitty one-liners through the bathroom door, but mercifully, you couldn't make out the words. At least someone's bombing worse than we did, said Ari. Hey, so how long ago did you get passed at the riot room? Couple of years ago, Nick said. You ever meet the owner? Paulie? Nah, not yet. Still waiting for someone to introduce me to... They paused, both simultaneously cocking an ear to the door. Mr. Magnificent had just gotten his first laugh of the evening. A pretty good one, too, considering he had cooled the audience down to the temperature of liquid nitrogen. Must have dropped his big closer, Ari said. Probably got it out of a Dirty Jokes coffee table book, Nick said. No doubt they were both right, but holy hell, was that dead-ass crowd enjoying it? They were still enjoying it. It must have been 8-10 seconds already, and the knuckleheads were still laughing. In fact, the laughter was getting louder. He's killing up there, Ari said. What the hell did he pull out of his ass? They hurried to the sinks and half-heartedly rinsed their hands. Out in the room, the stage was empty. What, had the audience been that thrilled to see the guy leave? Nick looked to the front door just in time to see the guy's ass disappear out in the street. That was him, all right, that ratty suit and geriatric shamble. But the audience was still laughing. Forget laughing, they were cracking the fuck up, knee-slapping, rolling back, falling on their asses, laughing. Ari and Nick looked at each other. What the hell happened here? Ari said. I've never got a laugh like that in my life. Just then, Alex, the MC, came stumbling towards them from the back of the club, one hand on his belly and the other one landing on his knee as he stopped in front of them to bend over laughing. When he came back up to face them, he had tears in his eyes. Bulbous veins protruded from his forehead and the sides of his neck. His face was purple in the neon lights from the bar. "Oh, my God," Alex wheezed. "Did you hear that guy's closer?" "We were taking a leak," Nick said. "Oh, my God," Alex said. "Holy shit. That has to have been the funniest fucking joke I've ever..." Alex doubled over, half laughing, half coughing. "What'd he say?" Ari asked. "Fuck, did we pick the wrong time to take a piss?" "Tell us the joke," Nick said. But Alex was practically debilitated with laughter. The whole club was in a goddamn uproar. The audience was falling out of their chairs, some of them literally rolling on the floor. ROFL, Nick thought. Typed 1,000,000 times a day. Never happened once in the history of mankind. Well, so much for the joke he was working on. It was happening right before his eyes. He and Ari met eyes again. What could that guy have said to cause such a cataclysm? He says... It was Alex, trying desperately to catch his breath. It was hopeless. He threw his head back and howled with laughter. All at once, it was more disconcerting than amusing. It had gone on too long. No joke could possibly be that funny. "He goes. The veins in Alex's neck bulged so obscenely, they seemed to fold in on themselves. His face was a deepening purple. His expression turned from hilarity to sudden horror. "Alex, chill out, man." A geyser of fluid erupted from Alex's mouth. "Holy shit," Ari said, narrowly escaping the splash. Another splash, then another, and another. Alex stood agape with his eyes rolling back in his head. Only then did Nick realize that the rhythmic bursts of vomit were not vomit at all, but blood. Alex fell backwards, his head hitting the floor with a final weakening spout. "Dude," said Ari, "what the hell is going on?" "I think we need to get out of here," Nick said. He turned to the bar. Danny had just come out of the back, was standing dumbfounded behind the bar holding 2 bottles of beer. When her eyes found Alex, his mouth weakly erupting blood on the floor, she dropped both bottles. The soundtrack to it all was uproarious laughter. Nick hurried to the bar and took Danny by the elbow. "Don't ask," he said. "Let's get out of here." As the 3 of them went for the door, a hysterical audience member collapsed, tipping over a table and landing face first on the floor. He didn't move. "Nick," Danny said, pointing at the man on the floor. "Come on," Nick said. "We gotta get the cops." There was no helping these people at this point. Plus, he had a serious case of the creeps. 2. The police were no closer to the answers they were looking for by the time they let Nick, Ari, and Danny back onto the street. It was 1 o'clock in the afternoon, and they were exhausted and hungry. All the cops had given them to eat were the same bologna sandwiches reserved for the guests in the drunk tank and lockup. Nick didn't blame the cops for being suspicious. It was tough to explain. The cops arrive on scene at 1:35 a.m. 2 comics and 1 bartender, unharmed. Inside, 13 dead. A bloodbath. Alex had only been the first to go. Esophageal varices, he heard one of the cops mention. A burst blood vessel in the throat attributed to the club owner's alcoholism. But the jury was out on everyone else. There was no logical explanation for it. People just don't laugh themselves to death. There was no way the cops were going to buy that line, so neither Nick, Ari, or Danny even suggested it during the extensive bouts of questioning. Last they heard, once the cops admitted defeat, they meant to investigate the matter as a possible gas leak. Maybe the lack of oxygen left everyone giddy, and they asphyxiated in the throes of hysteria. Nick and Ari, breathing the relatively fresh air in the bathroom, and Danny, safe from the fumes in the kitchen, survived. Could this really be possible? Admittedly, It made more sense than some weirdo coming on stage and cracking a joke so funny it killed everyone. The three of them were too tired and hungry to discuss it by the time they got out of the precinct. Ari bid them farewell, and Nick saw Danny to a taxi and sent her on her way. The story in the paper hardly did it justice. No big headline, no sensationalism suggesting a chemical attack. Just, tragic gas leak kills 13. It seemed like the cops and the news alike just wanted to put a button on it and put it behind them. Case closed. But Nick couldn't put it out of his mind. That creepy comic. What did he call himself? The Magnificent Rodney Walters. Could he really have killed the audience? What the hell had he said or done before the crowd lost their shit like that? The phone rang that Sunday morning, shaking Nick from a pleasant dream and instantly pissing him off. He had been doing sets until 3 a.m. and was planning to sleep until noon at the very least. So much for that. Hello? Nick, it's Ari. From the other night? It's 9 in the morning, dude. How'd you get my number? Danny had it. Dude, it happened again. You see the paper? Nick sat up suddenly. You're kidding me. There's no way this thing was a gas leak. It's that guy. Rodney Walters or whatever. 10 people dead, dude. Where? Slappy's. In Brooklyn? That's the one. It's closed now to investigate the gas leak. But there was no fucking gas leak. It was that guy. It must have been. Did they mention the guy? No, nothing. There's no way to find out either. Everyone died. It was that joke, dude. They heard the joke. Nick took a deep breath. God, he was tired. Listen, man, I don't know how to explain this either, but there's no way this actually happened the way it looks. You can't laugh yourself to death. It's just not possible. Listen, man, I know you were out working last night. I wouldn't have called you at 9 in the morning if I didn't have to. But ever since that night, I've been obsessed with this. I haven't done a set since Thursday. Do you have a point here, or can I go back to sleep? Of course I have a point, dude. Listen, meet me at Lucky's at noon. I have someone you have to meet. Really important, okay? I gotta sleep, man. Please, Nick, you have to trust me. Again, I wouldn't have bothered you if I... All right. I'll be there. Perfect. Lucky's at noon. I'll see you then. Nick hung up and set an alarm for 11:15 a.m. He lay back down and closed his eyes. But when he did, all he could see was that creepy comic. Rodney Walters. No more sleep was forthcoming. Thanks, Ari. 3. Lucky's Pizzeria, 12 p.m. When Nick walked in, he immediately saw Ari and some other guy sitting at a table in the back. He grabbed 2 slices and a soda and made his way back to join them. They had already eaten. Nick, thanks for coming. And again, sorry for waking you up. Again? I don't recall you apologizing the first time. Nice to meet you, Nick, said the man, hand extended. I'm John. He's a pastor's assistant at Bible Baptist Church, Ari said. And a comic, would you believe it? No kidding, Nick said. They shook hands. So I take it you don't work blue? He's filthy as hell, Ari said. Don't let the cross fool you. Hey, John said. I'm only a pastor's assistant. Fair enough, Nick said with a chuckle. So, what's the big emergency here? Not to downplay what happened or anything. He folded a slice and took a big bite. So, we've been talking ever since the thing happened? I was super freaked out. He's kind of my spiritual advisor, you know? Spiritual advisor? Aren't you Jewish? Hey now, John said. Jesus was too, remember? Touché, said Nick. Anyway, Ari went on, John is always suspicious of devilish shit going on. So when I told him about what we saw, He was all over it. It's been written, John said with sudden authority, that Satan, in all his craftiness and deceit, is constantly looking for ways to wreak havoc on Earth. And if this is what it sounds like, it can only be the work of the devil. The devil, dude, Ari said. It's been written, said Nick. That's a pretty vague way to attribute something to the supernatural. Specifically, John went on, in the ancient grimoires that preceded Jesus himself, that there exists a joke so funny that all those who hear it will die of laughter. Ancient grimoires, dude, Ari said. Obviously, John continued, the joke itself has never been transcribed. If it were, it would be the single most dangerous document to ever exist. All of mankind could be destroyed. Well, not really, said Nick. If you read it, you'd die, right? Kinda keeps you from spreading it, for lack of a better word. It has too been written that simply reading the joke will not kill the individual, but instead arms said individual with the joke's destructive power. The person needs only to tell the joke, and all who hear it will die, including the teller of the joke, him or herself. Just picture the destruction. The dead piled around water coolers, in locker rooms, in comedy clubs. Say someone uttered the joke over the radio or on television. It would only be a matter of time until the joke is transcribed to all the tongues of the world. Bodies piled in the streets, vermin, pestilence, the pit of hell, belching forth its infernal... All right, cool it, man, Ari said. We get the idea, believe me. Nick took another bite and sat chewing for a minute. Even if this was true, he said, that a joke like this could possibly exist, some evil joke that killed all who heard it. You mentioned the teller of the joke would also die, correct? Because he heard himself tell it, you mean? Precisely, said John. So that couldn't be what happened, because the guy on stage, when all this went down, walked back off the stage and out the door. Both Ari and I saw him go, right, Ari? But there is an explanation for that, Ari said. He and John glanced knowingly at each other. The devil has many names, John said. Beelzebub, Lucifer, Damien, Satan, the Morning Star. Rodney Walters, Ari said. The magnificent Rodney Walters is the devil. 4. The more Nick thought about his conversation with Ari and John, the more he wished he had only had one slice instead of two. The heartburn was brutal. He had been pushing the idea of anything surreal out of his mind ever since the night in the police station. It just wasn't rational to think a joke was so funny it could kill you. Even if there was such a joke, one that was so funny you'd need a Surgeon General's warning on it, there's no way it would kill everyone who heard it. Maybe the odd heart patient, or yes, possibly even an alcoholic club owner with a varicose vein in his throat, but never everybody. Was it possible John's take on the situation was accurate? Had the pit of hell belched forth Rodney Walters? Nick picked up the phone and canceled his spots at the riot room. As tired as he was today, attempting comedy tonight was a certain bomb. Screw it, he said. He was dozing on the couch at around 5 p.m. when the local news brought up the comedy club tragedy in Brooklyn. 10 dead from suspected gas leak. The second such tragedy in a week. More regulation needed? It didn't go any further into it than that. What were a couple dozen deaths in a city of zillions? Peanuts, that's what. Worth little more than the $10 you'd get for your 15-minute spot. No sooner than Nick closed his eyes did his cell phone ring again. He picked it up and looked at the number. It was Ari. Nick shook his head. They certainly had become fast friends, hadn't they? Hello? Nick, you got the TV on? Yeah, why? And why are you always calling me when I'm trying to sleep? Put on Channel 7, dude, quick. Nick grabbed the remote and hit 7. The Midtown Mania Comedy Festival was going on a week from today. The news was showing snippets from last year's festival. Big acts from around the country doing their best 15 minutes. Everyone selling t-shirts and CDs, taking pictures and signing autographs for the fans. Nick couldn't care less about it. The festival was huge, but guys on his level had no shot at all getting on stage at a show like that, much less a guy like Ari. The whole thing was a self-celebrating big shot fest. Maybe Nick would be in it one day, sure, but until that day, he was fully intent on resenting it. "Why do you care?" Nick asked. "Hoping to sneak in 5 minutes between Bill Burr and Dave Attell?" "You never heard about that big raffle?" "What big raffle? I try not to pay any attention to this shit." "Look, man, look, right now." Nick looked at the TV. There he was. The magnificent Rodney Walters, this year's first guest spot raffle winner. The lucky comedian will have the chance to perform 5 minutes in front of a massive crowd of an expected 80,000 comedy fans. A chance in a lifetime for sure. We at Channel 7 News wish Rodney Walters a magnificent performance indeed. Nick's stomach tightened. The pizza was creeping up his throat again. "I see," he said. "Dude, there's no way he could have won that contest without harnessing his infernal devil powers. There were like 50 zillion entries." "I can imagine," Nick said. "I mean, I know you aren't convinced or anything. I can totally understand. The whole thing sounds pretty crazy, but you gotta admit, like seriously, right? Devil powers, man." Nick took a deep breath. There was so much to absorb today. He hadn't even the resources to digest 2 slices of pizza. Biases toward the non-supernatural aside, he had to admit, it did seem like the odd, unknown comedian literally killed that night at Alex's club. And it did appear that the exact same scenario had taken place at Slappy's in Brooklyn mere nights later. And it did seem pretty unlikely that the same completely unknown, utterly shitty comedian would win, let alone meet any necessary qualifications to enter, a massive contest to perform in front of 80,000 people along with the nation's biggest, most prestigious acts. Yeah, the biases aside, Nick agreed. It kinda seems that way, doesn't it? And you know what that means, don't you? He's telling the goddamn joke, Nick. Everybody's gonna be there. My sister's gonna be there. All her friends, too. Can you convince her not to go? Nick asked. Just in case all this is true? She wouldn't miss it for the world, Ari said. She'd never listen to me, and besides, this isn't only about her. There'll be 80,000 people there, Nick. What are we supposed to do? Let them die? Ah, jeez. The 2 Nicks were engaged in battle. The rational, reasonable Nick and, well, the other Nick. Strange thing was, the other Nick was coming out on top. Hard as it may have been to believe, there was actually more evidence that the magnificent Rodney Walters was the devil seeking to commence hell on earth than there was to explain him as a shitty hack comic who got really lucky. Either way, Nick decided, whether in the name of God or the spirit of comedy, the fucker needed to be stopped. 5. Sunday, day of the Midtown Mania Comedy Festival. A record turnout of 90,000 people packed into Central Park to watch their favorite headliners on stage. A pamphlet with the set list showed 18 comedians total. Halfway down the list was the lucky contest winner, the magnificent Rodney Walters. The show was currently up to the 8th comic, Joey Diaz. Following him was scheduled Nick DiPolo. Then it would be time for Walters. If he had his way, Nick, Ari, and John knew the final 9 would never make it on stage. "You're absolutely sure, Ari?" Nick asked. "Trailer 10, he said. "They're all in order. Makes sense, right?" It makes sense, sure. I just wonder whether the security guy was talking out of his ass. He was telling the truth, John said. I have a nose for these things. Besides, Ari said, he wouldn't try to throw us off by sending us towards some big shots trailer. Unless Rogan's in that one, Nick said. They'd get a laugh out of watching him break our legs. God is on our side, John said. Certainly, he would never lead us astray. Nick almost chuckled at that, but seriously, what was there to chuckle at? If they were honestly here to confront the fallen angel of hell, it was pretty reasonable to believe that there was a God, and that in mind, he was pretty likely on their side. Fair enough, Nick said. With Joey Diaz captivating all in attendance, security guards included, the three comics walked with a cloak of divine invisibility to the row of trailers behind the huge stage. There was no security at all by Trailer 10. Steeling themselves, they approached the door. Know what I just realized? Ari said. I have no idea what the fuck we're supposed to do. Faith, John said. Have faith, ye of little faith. You really think that's all we need? Nick asked. Because I'd feel a lot more comfortable with a machine gun or something. Oh, me too, man, John said. Don't get me wrong. I'd love a machine gun, but I'm only a pastor's assistant. Gotcha, Nick said. He didn't, but this was no place for an open-ended question. With a mutual nod between them, Ari raised his fist and knocked on the door. Knock, knock, knock. A pause. Momentarily, they heard shuffling towards the door. It opened, and there he was, the Prince of Darkness, Rodney Walters. Yes, Satan asked. Get thee back, scourge of hell. John shot into the old man's midsection with an exasperated woof. Nick wasn't sure if it came out of the man or John. The two hit the floor, and Nick and Ari hurried inside, shutting the door behind them. What are you doing? Walters groaned. Sending you back to hell, said John. But something didn't seem right. If the old man really was Satan, would he really be panting on the floor right now? You'd think by now he would have morphed into his true form. Wings, goat horns, etc. Not that Nick was an expert by any stretch, but... Are you boys out of your minds? Walters snapped. Get off of me! I have to be on stage in 15 minutes. You don't fool me, bub. Beelzebub. John, hold up, Ari said. Maybe we got this wrong. He doesn't really seem so satanic right now. He's the Prince of Lies, John said. Just you wait. Any moment now, he'll be breathing hellfire. Only your hellfire cannot hurt me, Satan. I wear the fireproof cloak of faith. I'm a pastor's assistant. Okay, the exasperated old man said. Okay, you win. You win. Just please, let me up. Never. John wrapped his hands around the old man's neck and began to squeeze. The man let out an exasperated fart. Nick and Ari looked at each other, their resolve quickly fading. That's enough, Nick said. The two of them seized John and yanked him off of the man. John fought for a moment, but looked in their eyes and suddenly let up. Perhaps he saw mercy, forgiveness. The old man scooted back against the dresser and grabbed the edge of a drawer to help him stand. It took him a moment to catch his breath. You caught me. What can I say? The three looked at each other with confusion. Huh? Nick asked. Look, you're right about one thing, he said, still panting. I'm Satan. You got me. But this 70-year-old body isn't exactly equipped to breathe hellfire. So, you're pretty safe in that area. It was written you would return, declared John. Nah, that whole thing is later, Satan said. This weirdo decided to summon me So I popped in for a little visit. The enchantment wears off at midnight. Then it's back to the pit. I'm just hoping to wreak a little havoc before I leave. That's all. I knew it, John said, re-advancing with clenched fists. Have at thee. Gay guy walks into a deli, Satan said. John stopped in his tracks. Everyone froze. Don't you dare tell that infernal joke, John snapped. Hold on, Nick said. There's no way that's the start of this ancient death joke. He walks up to the deli counter, Satan continued. Stop, John commanded. In the name of God. Whoa, whoa. All four of the men, Satan included, turned to face the door. It was Dave Attell. Hey, didn't mean to interrupt you guys. I was just walking by. Thought I heard the start of a joke there. Mr. Attell, Nick said, trust me, this is no joke right now. Who you kidding? Dave said. Think I don't know a fucking joke when I hear one? Let's hear it, Rodney. Lay it on me. He points to the biggest baloney in the case, Satan continued. He goes, I'll take that one right there. John took another step toward Satan, but suddenly he lost his footing. His legs wobbled and he was forced to take a knee. Somehow the joke was already starting to take effect. The power of Christ compels you, he shouted. The power of Christ. Earplugs, Ari said. He's not stopping. John gave up his attempt at exorcism, and the three of them stuffed in their earplugs just like they had practiced. Dave Attell already had a smile creeping onto his face. Don't listen, Dave, shouted Ari. Cover your ears. Dave mouthed back silently. Shut up, dude. I gotta hear the punchline. The deli guy takes the bologna from the case and puts it up on the slicer. Whoa, 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 goes the gay guy. What, does my ass look like a slot machine? They only knew the joke was over by the look on Dave's face. First mild amusement, then laughter, finally knee-slapping laughter. His face, then his whole head turned a deepening shade of red. Dave Attell's head exploded. Blood, brains, skull fragments. They covered every square inch of the trailer. To Nick, Ari, and John, the sound had been a muffled pop, but the earplugs had worked. They were still alive. You killed Dave Attell, you son of a bitch! Ari was livid. Attell had been one of his favorites. Get thee hence, Satan! The three men, strength returned, rushed the demon once more. This time, Ari strangled him while Nick and John pinned him down. Satan was powerless to fight back with his geriatric body, but the grin never left his face. Incensed, Nick grabbed the little mole on the left side of the demon's nose and squeezed it. He pulled it, dug his thumbnail into it. He yanked it right off the man's face. With that, Satan's eyes went dark. 6. I mean, I'd love to buy this gold bond, but I have it on good authority they rubbed this shit on a flounder. Uproarious laughter. Flounder had been Ari's idea. Turns out it was a lot easier to say than tilapia, but a sufficiently funny-named fish. After murdering Satan in his trailer, the two had become fast friends after all. He'd even helped get Ari passed at the riot room. His act was pretty good. He felt bad for dismissing him the way he had initially. Danny was right. He was a pretty nice guy, other than continuing to call him whenever he was trying to take a nap. John, Ari had recently told him, was now not just an assistant, but a full-fledged pastor at Bible Baptist Church. He even had his own machine gun now, a useful thing in case Satan decided to possess another body and come after you. But for now, things were looking up. God had laid his hand upon Nick, and he acquired the comedy club from the late Alex's estate for pennies on the dollar. Not only could he go on stage whenever he wanted, but he had 3 taps installed on the bar. Here, here, and here. Guinness, Bud, and Bud Light. Nick walked off stage and sat at the bar. Promptly, Danny poured him a Bud. The light from the neons in the front window glimmered brilliantly in the amber liquid. Yes, indeed. Nothing beat a bud after a long day doing God's work. Ladies and gentlemen, we have a special treat for you all today. A surprise appearance from the one and only Dave Attell. A wild reaction from the packed room as the real Dave Attell walked out from behind the curtain and took the stage. Turns out the guy with his head blown off was yet another Dave Attell ripoff. Uncanny, this one. He had even looked just like him. No loss for the comedy community in any case, and what a relief it was for Ari when he learned his hero was still among the living. Nick smiled and took a big swig of beer. Danny? Yeah, hun? You ever feel like your life is like some crazy kind of poorly written story? Danny smiled. Totally, she said.
My name is Mortimer Lipschitz. I know the name itself suggests otherwise, but I shit you not, that's really my name. I used to wish it wasn't. On all that's holy, I wished it wasn't, but I suppose the name was never really the problem. The name was just the icing on a gluten-free cake with bad lungs and a high-pitched, lisping voice whined out from a face that, as I have been told many times, makes you want to punch it on sight and break those stupid glasses. Hang in there, shits. Those balls will drop one of these days, and then you'll drive all the girls wild. I tried to tell myself that there is some truth to this, that I'd have my time someday. So let them have theirs now. But there's not much you can say to reassure yourself when Brad Jenkins has your Star Wars undies hiked up past your belly button and everyone is laughing at you. That's hard to come back from. And if you go crying to a teacher, it's twice as bad the next time, and there's always a next time when you're in high school and your name is Mortimer Lipschitz. Oh wait, did I mention I have an enormous birthmark splashed across my face like an island on a map that nobody wants to visit? My mother always said it made me unique and beautiful. Brad always said that it makes my face look like a literal asshole. And so it makes sense that I'm called Lipschitz. Is it any wonder that when I first read the story of Rabbi Eliyahu, who successfully created a creature out of clay to do his bidding for him, I started to get ideas of my own? I will say this from the start, I never meant to hurt anyone. Though in retrospect, I should have been aware that people getting hurt would be the most likely outcome of this. I bought the clay in $20 intervals each week. That was my allowance, and it bought me 10 pounds off Amazon. Morty, what's the deal with this clay? My father asked me one day. He had no qualms about opening packages addressed to me. It was his house, and he had a right to know what was going on in it. I'm building models of Star Wars ships, since you never buy me the Lego ones when I ask. It's good to be thrifty, admitted my father, but foolish to indulge in fantasy. Space wizards won't help you in real life, Morty. Learning useful skills, that will. Always fair and wise, he added. Though perhaps you can parlay all this playing with clay into something useful at a later date. There's no shame in being a potter. As potters are needed no less in this world than doctors. Each plays his part, and so the world works. I started with the breasts. If I was going to craft a companion for myself, I figured I might as well swing for the fences. Which, by the way, I never made it past T-ball. To put it plainly, in addition to feeling extremely lonely and helpless in the world, I was horny. So sue me. I quickly learned that I had no innate ability as a sculptor. The breasts were misshapen and one was much larger than the other, but still they did the trick. Week by week, I added what parts the blocks of clay afforded me. An arm here, an arm there, both of them screwy and out of proportion, but arms nonetheless. Each night I put my creation in the closet, tucked away behind my button-up shirts. The next day I would go to school to the usual merciless bullying, dreaming of a day when I could bring my friend to life. I suppose I never actually believed that I could bring her to life, but even in her partially formed, decidedly lifeless state, she helped me. I pretended that she was alive and my friend, my lover. "Those guys are stupid," she'd say, her lumpy hand on my lap. "In 10 years, you'll be the CEO of a software company, and they'll be pumping gas at the Irving. Now unzip your pants, my love." It helped. Brad still gave me swirlies on a near daily basis, along with Melvins and Noogies, and everyone still laughed at me during the day. But when I got home, I had Shamira, my guardian. For though we did things together, she was first and foremost my protector against the world. And that's what the name Shamira means. I suppose even the other thing was a part of that protection. Burying myself in the soft folds of her flesh where nobody could hurt me. After many weeks of work, Shamira came to be complete. Standing back, looking at her, there was no denying that I had done a truly awful job. A 3-year-old child could have drawn a more convincing human body than I'd fashioned out of clay. But it didn't matter. I had a friend. In the lore, you're supposed to etch a word into your golem and say the appropriate prayer in Hebrew. I straightened out a paperclip and wrote "friend" on Shamira's shoulder and repeated the prayer from a book. Then I stood back and watched. I knew in my mind that nothing would happen, but my heart hoped. Shamira didn't move. Of course she didn't, you idiot, I reprimanded myself. I sat staring at her in dejected silence for a long time. I couldn't even bring myself to pretend that night. All I could think about was what a miserable, desperate loser I was. And always would be. There would be no future for me. The world belonged to Brad now. And it always would. Finally, I was dragged out of my deep trance of self-pity by my father, banging at the door.
"Time for bed, Morty! Get those teeth brushed! What, you want me to pay $7,000 for a dentist to yank out your molars painfully? Because you couldn't be bothered to do this simple task?"
I got up, sighed, and shoved my shameful and pathetic creation into the closet. Tomorrow, I'll tear it apart into 1,000 shapeless humps of clay, and then throw it all in the trash where it belongs. The next morning, I awoke to find Shamira in bed next to me. What in the actual fuck? I wondered. Must have gone sleepwalking again. Sleepwalking was one of my many nighttime problems. I still, at 15 years old, pissed myself on occasion in the middle of the night. I groaned at how miserable I was. My subconscious wouldn't let this fantasy go. I had gotten up in the middle of the night and dragged that thing into bed with me. And then I felt something move. Under the covers, something was wrapping itself around my most private of parts. I looked wide-eyed at Shamira's Picasso-esque face. It seemed to be donning a wide grin. I know I was. Shamira was alive. There was little doubt about that, though there was some doubt. Perhaps I had finally broken completely with reality, the bright line between fact and fantasy having been eroded into dust by the crushing weight and grind of my desperation. Well, if that was the case, I was alright with that too. My father was banging on the door again.
Time to get up, Morty! Shake off your dreams and come meet the day already!
I collected myself. I'll be right along, Father. Then I turned to Shamira. You need to stay in the closet, I whispered. I have to get to school now, but I'll see you this afternoon. Do you understand? Shamira nodded and swung a leg out from under the covers. She stood up, moving in unnatural fits and starts, wobbling, tottering, and lumbering. I couldn't believe it. She was actually moving. She put her hand on the closet knob and threw the door open, nearly taking it off the hinges. Then she stepped in and slammed the door behind her.
What's with the horrendous noise, Morty?
My father called. Sorry, Father, I just dropped one of my school books.
Be careful with those! They contain priceless knowledge, Morty!
I went about my morning routine in a giddy daze. It worked. She's real. I have a friend. I have a friend. My mother dropped me off at school. It was the last day before the holiday breaks, and it turned out to be absolutely miserable. First, because I longed painfully to be in my room with Shamira. And second, because Brad and his friends sensed some measurement of happiness stirring within my soul, and so dished out the punishment twice as hot as usual. They had been making overtures all day, and then, as I was walking into the cafeteria for lunch, they went for the kill. Before I could even process what was happening, I was yanked into the boys' bathroom. Paul and Mac, two of Brad's thuggish friends, held me by the arms as Brad looked me over. What is it with you today, lipshit? You've had this shit-eating grin on your face all day. You haven't been eating shit again, have you? Have you, Mortimer? Have you been eating shit again? Answer me. A bit of boldness came over me. Though, in retrospect, I should have squashed it immediately. No, I said. I've got a girlfriend. That's all. Brad laughed. Bullshit! Maybe a little boyfriend. I could see that. Is that what you meant, lip shit? Found a little boyfriend so you could eat the shit out of his asshole? 2.5 hours. 2.5 more hours. Then I'll be with Shamira. Then I'll be with Shamira. Okay, Brad. Sure. Brad laughed again. A vicious laugh, devoid of anything resembling good humor. You guys hearing this? Lipshit here loves smearing shit from his boyfriend's asshole all over his lips. That's fucking disgusting, said Paul. Gross little freak, said Mac. They both squeezed my arms a little tighter. Why won't they just leave me alone if they don't like me? I wondered. Now, said Brad. This is a judgment-free zone. It's a safe space. If Mortimer here wants to eat shit, we should respect that. I think you boys owe Shitlips here an apology. Sorry, Shitlips, said Paul. If you want to eat shit, that's your lifestyle choice, and it's not my place to judge you for that. I apologize, said Mac. They squeezed me a little tighter. It hurt. Don't cry. It will only encourage them. An apology is fine, said Brad. But if you think about it, just words. What good are words? Hadn't thought about it like that, said Paul. Guess words aren't really worth much after all now that you mention it, said Mac. 2.5 hours. As so it happens, said Brad, I would like to offer you a gift. Mortimer, to make up for the crassness of my associates here, a real, solid gift. That's a great idea, said Paul. Well, nothing beats a gift, said Mac. A real solid gift. Do you know what it is, Shitlips? Asked Brad. I shook my head. I wanted to leave. I wanted to leave so badly. Maybe I would. After this incident, I'd fake a stomachache and have my mother come pick me up. It wouldn't be the first time. There, in that stall, said Brad, pointing behind me. There was a fresh turd. Coach has me on a high-fiber diet, so it's a good one, I assure you. So, go ahead and eat it. It's all yours, since you love eating shit so much. I saved it for you. It took a moment for Brad's words to fully hit the processing center of my brain. No, they're not. They're not really going to make you eat a turd. They're just trying to scare you. And if that was their intention, it was working. Please, I muttered. Brad smiled. I already said you could have it. You don't have to beg. I don't want to. Please don't make me do it. I'm sorry. Whatever I've done, I'm sorry. Kinda disrespectful to refuse my gift, said Brad, frowning now. Is there something wrong with my shit? I realized there was no way out. They were going to do with me as they pleased. I never had a chance. Then I did start sobbing. My asthmatic lungs constricting and making my breath come out in jagged gasps. Please don't make me do it. Don't make me do it. Brad reached over and took off my glasses. I saw the blur of him reaching his fist back and slamming it into my nose. I heard a terrible crunch as pain spread out across my face and inside of my head. Next time, he said, the glasses stay on. He put them back on me, and I saw him clearly then, alive with a burning, unstoppable cruelty. Okay, I'll do it. That's a good boy. Just one bite, really. It's the polite thing to do. Let me know that my gift has some value to you. Paul and Max spun me around and shoved me into the stall. And then there I was, face to face with Brad's stinking turd. It was enormous, coiled up like a snake, with bits of it dissolving into the toilet water. My head was swimming in pain and fear, and my heart was thudding in my ears. I did not want to do this. But I saw little choice in the matter. There was no escaping it. I reached into the toilet and grabbed the turd, feeling it squish between my fingers. That was all it took. I let forth a torrent of vomit, all down my arm and into the toilet bowl. Behind me, I could barely hear the three hyenas delighting in my pure misery. Could barely hear them over the buzzing in my head. Oh my God! He was gonna do it! One of them said, in between a fit of laughter. He was actually gonna eat a piece of shit! And then I heard them walking away, out of the bathroom. I stood there in the stall, my arm covered in shit and puke, my face dripping with tears and blood. The lunch bell rang for the second time, indicating that the lunch period was over and done with. just as I finished cleaning up. That was just as well. I had lost my appetite. I went straight from the bathroom to the Nurse Henley's office. There was little need to put on an Oscar-worthy performance. I had seen my reflection in the bathroom mirror. I looked like an abandoned orphan tossed at death's front door, and I felt that way too. Even the promise of returning to my room and being with Shamira held little joy. All joy, in fact, had been beaten out of me, and I was humiliated. I had done nothing wrong that I could understand other than having the audacity to be Mortimer Lipschitz. The nurse hung up the phone and shook her head. Nobody's answering. Is there another number we could try? I thought about having her call my father. I would never hear the end of it, nor would my mother. It's not that my father was abusive, he had very, very specific and unyielding ideas about how life should be conducted, and calling a man away from important business because you have a little tummy ache was something you did not do. He would lecture me on and begin to place extra scrutiny on me. He would search thoroughly for bad influences in my life and almost certainly would find out about Shamira. As bad as I felt in that moment, calling my father would provide little relief and would only serve to make things worse. I shook my head. Let's try in a couple of minutes. Is it okay if I stay here while I wait? Of course, dear, said Nurse Henley. You look due for some rest, and I have some paperwork to file with the front office. You just sit here, and then when I come back, we can try again. I sat and looked out the window at the wretched world. They were having gym class outside today. Dodgeball. I was glad I wasn't there. I saw Brad palm one of the rubber balls, lift his arm up high, and absolutely wing the thing at Henry Gladwell. Henry, like me, was a weakling. He toppled over onto his ass and sat there with a stunned look on his face. I sighed and looked back down at my shoes, then back outside. Off in the distance, beyond the athletic field, I saw movement. Something was coming. It moved in fits and starts, sometimes stopping and then seeming to somehow grow larger as it stood there. I blinked my eyes hard and shook my head. That blow from Brad must have rattled me worse than I thought. The thing was still there, getting closer and growing larger. It was red. It was... No, can't be. Is it? It was close enough now that there was no mistaking it. One enormous lopsided breast bounced higher than the other, which was quite a bit smaller. It was Shamira, and as she got closer, I saw what she was doing. She was reaching down and pulling up a handful of earth, then slapping it on her body. Her body absorbed it, adding to its mass, making my friend grow larger and larger. Henry saw her first. He was sitting on the bench when he reached out an arm to point and started shouting something. One by one, hands turned in Shamira's direction. And then, when the eyes conveyed the message to the brain, extended horizontally in slack-jawed amazement. Nobody had ever seen anything like it. What was it? Shamira was by then twice as tall as the gym teacher, who was blowing his whistle and pointing at the side door to the school. He was yelling, "Inside!" I could hear it through the window. "Everybody get inside!" The crowd didn't need all that much convincing. I witnessed feats of athleticism that the gym teacher wouldn't have been able to coax out of those students in 100 years. People were sprinting, elbowing each other, leaping over each other, moving with a single-minded purpose. To get away from the thing that even now was taking a scoop out of the 50-yard line and patting those spoils to the side of its monstrous head, making it bigger and even more monstrous. Shamira? I thought. can you hear me?
Yes, friend. I hear.
Please, don't hurt anybody.
They hurt you, friend.
Shamira took a massive step forward, going from the 50 to the 40-yard line in one stride. Mac was standing in the end zone, transfixed. His friends were pulling at his arms, trying to get him to move, but he seemed to be in a state of shock. Finally, they gave up on him and ran with all their might. They did, but that doesn't mean that we should hurt them now. Nothing is gained by perpetuating the cycle of violence. Leave them be. I'll meet you at home.
They hurt you, friend.
Finally, Mac's brain seemed to awaken, and he made a desperate move to run. It was far too late. Shamira stood towering over him, and even after he had made it a few yards away, all she had to do was sweep her arm out, which she did. The impact of the back of her hand upon Mac's body sent him catapulting through the air like a wayward dodgeball. Stop! Stop! Shamira, please! Shamira pivoted her body to face Max. He was lying on the ground, rocking back and forth in pain. She reached out and plucked him up in one hand. No! She lifted him up into the air so that his small, terrified eyes were level with her giant, enraged eyes. And she tightened her grip. No, stop, please! I'm begging you! I'm commanding you!
They hurt you.
The unrestricted parts of Mac's body began thrashing violently around in a vain attempt at escape, or in an expression of agony. I don't know. Most likely both. Next door, in the front office, there was an explosion of panicked shouting. The students were pouring in the side door, screaming in terror. Outside, Mac did not thrash around for very long. And when he stopped, it was clear that he would never thrash again. Shamira dropped his corpse to the ground, a flood of intestines rushing out of his ruptured stomach. Shamira bent down, scooped up an enormous handful of earth, and packed it into her body. She repeated this action, able to add on more mass to her body the larger she grew, so that she grew exponentially. The principal's voice boomed out over the speakers. If I may have your attention, all students and faculty are to remain inside of the school building, in the safest place that you can find. Just hide under a desk if you can find one. This is not a drill. We are in the midst of an active situation. The police have been notified and are en route. Everything, we're gonna be okay. Just don't go outside. If you pray, then pray. Shamira slammed her fist through the side of the building. A moment later, she was pulling Paul out. He was pinched between her giant fingers. She held him aloft, and then reached inside the school again with her unoccupied hand to pull out Brad. My tormentors' faces looked, for the first time, like mine had usually looked, vulnerable and terrified. I stood up and ran through the front office, through the headless pandemonium and out the hole in the side of the building. Shamira looked down at me. Stop this! I shouted. Let them go! You frightened them! Let that be enough! She flicked one of her free fingers and Paul's head went sailing through the air, all the way across the football field and through the goalpost on the other side. The rest of Paul was dropped unceremoniously and splattered apart on impact with the ground, flecking me with blood and bits of gore. Help! Screamed Brad. Morty, please! Morty, please help me! I'll do anything! I should have known. I should have known from the legends. They all end the same way. They all... And then I had the answer. I ran over to Shamira's foot and began clawing my way up her leg. She didn't notice, as far as I could tell. She had forgotten all about me and was now a being of mindless destruction. When I tried to communicate with her in my mind, there was only a harsh static. Morty, please! I'm so sorry for everything! I was only ever joking! I scurried up her side, past that special fold that I knew so well. It was now as large as my entire body. I kept climbing, beyond exhausted from the effort. I looked up, beyond the twin mountains that served as her breasts, to see her lift Brad to her mouth. She bit him in half, swallowing the bottom half and setting the top half down, very gently, on the field. Brad was still alive. Jagged strings of organs, spurting blood and other fluids out of his torn torso. He was screaming so loudly that it hurt my ears. But I kept climbing, grasping onto a nipple and hauling myself up. Please don't kill me, I thought. Shamira punched another opening into the school, this time on the second floor. Standing perched on her shoulder, I was looking right in on Mr. Peterson's AP English class. 24 shocked and terrified faces, staring at something that defied rational thought. I clambered down Shamira's shoulder a bit, until I finally reached it. I dug my fingernails in with all of my strength, furiously tearing away at the first F, and then the R, and then finally, the I, sending handfuls of clay flying through the sky. And then, it was over. End. Shamira went immediately slack and began collapsing on herself. I scrambled in a mindless frenzy of terror to stay on her highest point as she fell, knowing that if I had landed in the wrong place, that would be it. The end for me as well. I hit the ground and everything went black. I woke up in the hospital with my father sitting by my bedside.
You created a golem,
he said. Yes, I did. I lifted my head painfully. Where is Mother? Is she okay?
Your mother is fine. The golem locked her in the basement, but she was unharmed. The same can't be said for some of your classmates.
My father coughed.
Nobody knows that it was you. Nobody knows what happened, frankly. There's talk that somebody spiked the school water supply with a hallucinogen. That everybody went temporarily mad. And that the whole affair ought to be kept under wraps until a proper cause can be found. A perpetrator. Somebody to blame.
My father sat silent for a moment, rubbing his coarse black beard with one hand.
The truth is important, son. So tell me, why did you do it? Was it for power? An expression of rage? Simply out of too much idleness, perhaps?
I propped myself up on an elbow, while the machines beeped all around me. I just wanted a friend. I bit my lip, trying to fight back the tears. It didn't work.
Friend,
my father repeated, clearly weighing the word over in his mind.
Yes, I suppose that a friend is a fine thing to have. Those boys that died, they weren't your friends, were they?
No.
Did you want them dead? Be truthful.
No, but I tried to stop shit. The golem, I didn't want it to kill them.
Be truthful, son.
I closed my eyes and searched my soul. Had I wanted Brad and his friends to die? Maybe there was a passing moment, I said slowly. When I wished they weren't here anymore. When they were trying to get me to eat shit, I heard my father cough.
Do you mean that literally? Son, they tried to make you eat shit?
I opened my eyes. Yes, a literal turd. Said my father. He fell back into stroking his beard. He started clicking his tongue against the roof of his mouth. Between that and the beeping of the hospital equipment, there was a strange rhythm in that room, as of a world part human, part mechanical, in proper working order. At last, my father pronounced his judgment.
Life is hard, and harder still when you're alone in the world. It is hard beyond hard when you are actively persecuted, though you have committed no wrong through your actions. During such trials, we grow desperate and cling to whatever comfort is available. In your case, son, you sought comfort by creating the golem. That is understandable, although you ought to thought much further of the consequences of your actions. The golem went on to grow monstrously large and murderous. It's not the first time that this has happened. According to the books, it is important to pay heed to the lessons that have already been learned by those that came before us. That is why we pass them from generation to generation. You did wrong, son. Though, less wrong than you could have. And for justifiable reasons. As an appropriate punishment, I am canceling your participation in Hanukkah this year.
I thought it over. It seemed fair enough. After all, worse things can happen. Hanukkah is canceled, I said. My father nodded.
Well, I should really be getting back to the office now. I'm glad that you're well, Mortimer. You'll be back home before you know it.
My father stood up and left without any further ceremony. I was alone again. The machines kept beeping. Oh, Shamira, I muttered. Why'd you have to go and kill him? Morty? I looked up. They must have me on some powerful drugs, I thought. Because this isn't happening. I don't know if you know me, but, I'm Jessica Farley. I used to date Brad. The beeping machines started to beep faster. I've seen you around.
Oy vey! Was she gorgeous?
So, everybody's pretending that they didn't see a giant monster attack our school. They're pretending that they didn't see you climb up that beast and stop it. But, I saw it. That is congruous with my recollection, I said. I'm not dumb, you know. I know what you just said. You probably just think I'm dumb because I was with Brad. If I thought you were dumb, it was a self-defense mechanism. Because I knew that I never had a chance with you. It was easier to put the blame on you than it was to put on myself. Huh. What the fuck is in this IV drip anyway? Something good, that's for sure. What if I told you that you did have a chance with me? Would you still think that I was dumb? My asthmatic lungs pushed out a wheeze that was meant to be served as laughter. I'd think that you thought I was dumb. Well, I don't. And you do. She pressed a piece of paper into my palm. The machines started beeping even faster. It sounded like they were on the verge of exploding. When you get out of here, give me a call. Okay? Jessica left and I laid there for a long time, not moving. The paper with her number on it crumpled up in my hand, getting damp with sweat. Mortimer Lipschitz, I thought. That's my name. And there's nothing wrong with it.
I grew up in a place called Liar's Fane, or the Fane as locals called it. A solid 2.5 hours from anywhere worth going. I lived with my grandmother in her rustic, weathered farmhouse, just beyond the edge of the Fane, set adrift in the countless acres of wheat and corn that occupied the empty space between towns. Nana was well known in the Fane. The townsfolk called her an herbalist, but it was bullshit and they all knew it. Nana had a gift. It was real and palpable. You could sense it just being around her, like the static charge before a lightning strike. People from the area came to see my grandmother for all sorts of reasons. Some were desperate for a family, others had failing health, and a few just needed an understanding ear. Nana listened to their problems, with the patience I'd often benefited from during my teenage years. Then she'd offer sage advice, along with a poultice, tincture, or herbal bundle, delicately wrapped up in a sheer muslin cloth. Her guests left feeling better, lighter, and with careful instructions on how to use the potent mixture they were given.
"It's all about intention,"
she told me, slowly grinding her obsidian pestle into its paired mortar filled with willow bark.
"If you make something with love, good things will come to those it touches."
I'd always wondered if the opposite was true. I learned everything I could from her, about plants and their different uses, and about the power of intention. She often told me I was naturally gifted when it came to herbs, though she never let me help her while she worked, always saying it was too dangerous. When I turned 18, I moved to the city to attend university. Nana insisted I leave the Fane and never look back, forbidding me from even coming to visit, saying that the place had a way of holding on to you. We talked over the phone several times a week, then through video calls when I sent her a laptop for Christmas. She cried when she saw me on the computer screen, remarking how grown up I looked. I couldn't believe how she looked exactly the same. A month before her 100th birthday, she called me. But this time, she acted strangely, saying and doing things with an air of finality that frightened me. She told me everything was fine, and I didn't need to worry, but there was something in her voice that told me it was time to come home. She blanched when she saw me on her doorstep, then gathered me into a fierce hug, scolding me for daring to come back. At first, I thought I'd overreacted, mistaking Nana's strange behavior for something more worrisome, but she seemed as lucid and wily as ever. In fact, it felt as though nothing had changed. It was just as I remembered it from my childhood. A steady stream of people coming and going throughout the day. The smell of crushed lavender mingling with cedar. And Nana, shouting for me to hunt down one herb or another from her entropic garden. I sat on the sun-baked porch, where tangled masses of withering vines mounted a decades-long assault on the cracked and battered wood. To my surprise, I had settled back into the strange silence of the country as though I'd only been away a few days, instead of over a decade. Nana's voice carried through the kitchen's open window, calling me inside.
"You remember Mrs. Linden, don't you?"
Nana said, motioning to the regal, silver-haired woman seated next to her. The woman stood and grabbed my hand, shaking it with restrained enthusiasm. Her piercing eyes, as silvered as her hair, locked on to mine. "Oh, it's been such a long time. We're all very excited to see what you're capable of." I smiled politely, then gave Nana a questioning look. "What I'm capable of?" "Well, I should be going now. I'll come back tomorrow to pick up my order," the woman said, ignoring the question. She swept from the room and out the front door, shutting it quietly behind her. "What the hell was that about?" I said. Nana smiled sadly, then motioned for me to sit.
"Doris says her husband has something of a violent temper, and it's only getting worse."
"Oh, I said, as Nana filled 2 cups with a steaming rosy-colored tea.
Shouldn't she tell the sheriff or something?
Nana shook her head. She seemed to age as we sat there.
No, this is something I think you can handle,
she said, sliding me her obsidian mortar and pestle. I'd always been forbidden from touching Nana's tools, resigned to only watching her craft the herbal remedies the people of the Fane so highly regarded. I reached out, touching it as though it were a sacred object. Me? I said, sliding my fingers over the mortar's black, glassy surface.
If you were to make something for her, what intention should you have?
Protection, I suppose, I said, feeling a sudden knot forming in my stomach. Something was wrong. Why did she suddenly want my help, making a mixture she could make blindfolded?
So, now you have your tools and your intention. What comes next?
Nana grabbed her gnarled wooden cane and pointed it in the direction of her whitewashed cupboards. I rose from my chair and opened the lowest cupboard doors, revealing an overly large spice rack. I shifted through the countless glass jars, small cloth pouches, and unmarked tins. Agrimony, nettle, and blessed thistle, I said, pulling each from the shelf as I found them.
Good girl.
Nana tapped her cane on the floor in applause. She stood with some effort, edging closer to watch as I placed leaves and stems into the waiting mortar. I hesitated, unsure of what exactly I was supposed to make. Nana held up her index finger, as gnarled and crooked as the cane she leaned on.
Never forget, little one. It's your intention that's key.
I nodded, and began working the bits of dried herbs into a fine powder, as I'd seen my grandmother do 1,000 times before. It went on that way for almost a week, though Nana offered less and less input with each order I filled, content to just sit and watch. The morning of Nana's birthday, I sat at her bedside, a tray of toast and coffee cooling at my feet. Her eyes were open, staring into the empty space above the foot of her bed, while grasping a massive, tattered tome in one rigged hand, and an ornate wooden box in the other. I gently removed each from her grip, placing them on the nightstand, then closed her eyes. She looked so serene lying there, so peaceful. I stood there for a long time, watching her, and realizing I didn't feel all that surprised. Nana did everything with purpose, and during the past week, it felt as though she were preparing to go somewhere. It was like the excited energy on the night before a big trip. Sad to leave, but excited to go. Nana's house was full that night. The people of Liar's Fane turned out to pay their respects, but the evening was filled with strange, offhand comments, echoing the words of Mrs. Linden the week before. "We're so excited to see what you're capable of." I retreated upstairs, away from the nauseating hum of laughter and small talk, into the quiet of Nana's darkened room. I stood, unmoving, staring down at the tray of this morning's untouched breakfast, as tears slipped down onto the front of my shirt. I sat on the edge of her bed, letting my head fall into my hands for a few brief, unstoppable sobs. The creaking of mattress springs and rustling of blankets startled me. I sprang to my feet. I could see the mattress bowing, as if under someone's weight. Then came the smell of lavender. I quickly turned on the light, blinking away the teary haze. The room was again silent, and the scent gone. The book I'd placed on the bedside table that morning was cracked open to a dog-eared page midway through. I leaned in to examine the handwriting on the brittle yellowed paper. The child, bound by birth, must bear the iniquity of the forefather. I felt a chill crawl its way up my spine, standing my hairs on end. I didn't know what it was supposed to mean, but it had a physical effect all the same. The feeling of eyes on me made me turn. Mrs. Linden stood motionless in the doorway. "There you are," she said, reanimating to glide toward me. Grabbing my hand, she pulled me back toward the stairs, where the townspeople had gathered. The laughter and small talk had been replaced by an oppressive silence, as Mrs. Linden stopped us on the second stair from the bottom. "We just wanted to say how much we appreciated your grandmother. She was a part of all our lives, but we know she left us in good hands." The crowd raised their assorted glasses in a solemn salute. "Thank you, but I'm not staying," I said. The serious expressions of the crowd lessened, as the corners of everyone's mouth seemed to curl upward in a unified, knowing smile. "Your grandmother was the same way at first, but she came round, and so will you." Mrs. Linden's grip on my arm held me like a vice. I winced in pain and tried to pull away, but every movement I made was met with her hand clamping tighter into my flesh. I stopped struggling and stared at her in disbelief. She let go and smiled. "See how easy that is?" she said. The crowd murmured their approval, then continued their jovial small talk. I rubbed my arm. It ached and throbbed. I was certain a bruise was already forming. These people were crazy if they thought they could bully me into staying. I don't know what kind of hold they had over Nana, but it wasn't going to work with me. Nana told me to never come back, and this must have been why. It was midnight before the house was finally empty again. I turned out the lights and bolted the door, then crept up the stairs to Nana's bedroom, slipping across the oak boards as though I might wake her. I grabbed the book and box from the nightstand, then stopped at the door, turning to face the room as the faint smell of lavender wafted past. "Nana?" I said into the darkness, but there was no answer. Down the hall in my bedroom, I cradled the giant tome in my lap, turning each page with the care a book of its age required. Page after page of recipes for potent herbal remedies, short passages about the properties of plants, and journal entries about Nana's life filled every inch of writing space. The oldest were faded and nearly unreadable, but the last entry was made the night Nana died.
"I'm sorry, little one. I wanted to spare you from this if I could. I tried to keep you away from them, but I knew sooner or later you'd come back. I'd intended to make a go of it myself, but now it's up to you. I left you something to help, but the contents of the reliquary won't be enough on its own."
I caught the fleeting image of a dark figure in my peripheral, but tried to ignore it. As a child, I was no stranger to spotting shadows out of the corner of my eye, or hearing voices whispering at night. But I was never afraid of them. I never worried, because I knew I was safe with Nana. Now she was gone, and I shuddered at having to face them alone. I turned my attention to the ornate wooden box, the reliquary Nana mentioned. Several sigils were burned onto the wooden bottom, while metal runes were inlaid along the edges, meeting at an iron clasp in the middle of the lid. It reminded me of a miniature coffin, or maybe that was just the kind of day I was having. the figure appeared again, lingering longer than before. I squeezed my eyes shut, trying to will it away. Breath hit my skin, hot and acrid. Then fingers combed through my hair. I screamed, flailing my arms in wild circles at the empty space around me. I bolted from the bed. I could feel spectral hands reaching for me as I ran from the room into the hallway. I turned back as I reached the top step. A powerful force pushed me off balance, sending me tumbling to the unforgiving floor at the bottom of the stairs. My head throbbed where it collided with the ground, and my vision blurred. The shadowy figure stood at the top of the stairs, shrouded in a black mist, with two glinting silver eyes. I scrambled to my feet and swung around the banister, sprinting through the house and out the back door, to where my rusted little station wagon was parked. I jumped in, grabbing the keys from the visor. I nearly spun out on the gravel of the long road leading to the old farmhouse, then sped onto the desolate stretch of County Road, heading away from the house and the Fane. I could handle all the legalities by phone, or I could come back with some of my friends to ward off the local color. For now, it was best to just get away. There was nothing for hours. The sun was already starting to peek out in pinks and yellows from beyond the horizon. But the corn and wheat just kept going. It didn't matter. I was putting distance between me and the Fane. Finally, I saw a turnoff and took a chance, hoping there would be somewhere I could get some gas, or at least use a phone. The wind changed directions, making my wake of gravel dust lurch out in front of me, obscuring my view as I crept along the narrow country road, but I could still make out a structure in the distance. My car stalled out as I pulled up to the familiar shape of my childhood home. I was back. I drove all night and part of the day, and somehow I ended up back at Nana's. I knew you'd be back. Didn't I say she'd be back? Doris Linden reclined in one of the Adirondack chairs, lined up on the wraparound porch. Beside her, a young couple lounged in the mid-morning sun. Did I have a choice? I said, trying to control the anger I felt flooding my face and chest. Oh, hon, of course not. She laughed politely. You're ours now, kiddo. That power of yours sealed the deal. What do you mean? The powder you made me worked like a charm. I sprinkled it all over a picture of my husband, like you said. Then he sprinkled himself all over the living room with a shotgun. God, I laughed so hard I thought I was gonna wet myself. She stood, and the others followed after her, chuckling. He what? I sank to the ground, all the fight draining out of me. Oh, don't look so upset. You did good. I've been trying to get rid of him for years. Who are you people? I said, my voice weak and pathetic. The group smiled, silver flashing in their eyes. We are the followers of Mendax, the man said, adjusting his wireframe glasses. The Fane is his temple, and we are his children, the young woman added. He lives through us. Doris opened her arms in a wide gesture, as though it had all been well rehearsed. What the hell is a Mendax? Oh, an old deity. He was here long before we showed up, and I'm sure he'll be here long after we're gone. She looked me up and down, then shook her head in disappointment. You know, your family's always had power. I don't know where it came from, but it's in your blood. Hardly seems fair, does it? Someone centuries ago pissed off a god you've never even heard of, but you're the one who pays the price. She looked sympathetic for a moment. Well, you know what they say. Shit rolls downhill. The trio howled with laughter. I got to my feet and ran to the house. We've had a hold of your family for the last 200 years, sweetie, so don't go thinking you're gonna get away from us," Mrs. Linden said as I ran past. I slammed the door shut behind me and locked the deadbolt, then retrieved Nana's book and box from my bedroom and hurried to the kitchen. I seized the obsidian mortar and pestle from its place above the spice cupboard. Leaves, twigs, and dried flowers churned into powder beneath the force of the pestle. I held my intention in my mind. Repel evil. I sprinkled a line of powder in front of every possible entrance I could think of, then gathered my courage to peek out the front window. They were still out there, staring at the house, but they had moved out further onto the lawn. I went back to the book, opening it up to the marked page I was shown before. The child, bound by birth, must bear the iniquity of the forefather. I scanned further down the page, until I saw the name Mendax, who Nana described as a filthy being of deception. Not a demon exactly, but not too far off the mark. Mendax the Liar, written in my grandmother's curved and flowing style. An old evil who preyed upon our family when we refused to submit our power to his rule, cursing those born with a gift to serve his followers. I could hear cars pulling up outside, and voices calling out to one another in greeting. These people, Nana's journal continued, the people of the Fane, they are his true children, in body and spirit, the result of an old god philandering with humans. "Yeah, awesome. Is there a way to stop it?" I said, flipping frantically through the pages. "Nana, if you can hear me, a loophole would be great right about now." The scent of lavender breezed past. The jars of herbs I had set out all tipped over at once, flooding the table with small dried flowers and leaves that encircled the wooden box. The relic. I'd nearly forgotten about it. I flipped open the clasp, and the lid sprang open. I gasped, throwing the box back onto the table, then took a few steps back in disgust. Inside, a shriveled human hand was curled into a loose fist. A note fitted into the box's lid, unfurled slightly, its corner caressing the gray, leathery skin of the dead hand. I could see yellow bone peeking out from where the once loose skin had been tied off with a bit of twine around the stumps of the severed radius and ulna. I plucked the note from the box, avoiding all contact with the ghoulish keepsake. Beneath the note was a form-fitted indent into the box's velvet lining, where an off-white candle was held. The note gave detailed instructions on the use of the hand and the candle. I took another quick look through the window. The whole town had gathered. The Church of Mendax was assembling on Nana's lawn, and they were headed my way. I went back to the note, reading it aloud. "Okay. Place the candle of human tallow, gross, between the fingers of the hanged man's fist, then light the wick to cause all who see it to succumb to paralysis." Normally, I would have laughed at the ridiculousness of it all, but desperation has a weird way of making you willing to try new things. A window broke somewhere toward the back of the house, followed by banging. I reached out, grabbing the pickled thing, and wedged the candle between the middle and ring finger. I plunged my hand in the junk drawer, the most likely place for matches to be. I could hear wood splintering, then several sets of footsteps inside, making their way to the kitchen. Finally, my shaking hand took hold of a matchbox. I looked up to see silver eyes staring back at me from the darkness beyond the gap of the pocket door. "Oh shit! Oh shit!" I fumbled with the matches, dropping them to the floor. The door slid open with such force, it broke through its frame, coming to a stop somewhere inside the wall. I grabbed the matches again, and flicked the first match against the strike strip forcefully. The head lit, but broke off from the wooden stick, tumbling into the pile of herbs on the table, which began to release fragrant smoke. The silver-eyed mob breached the kitchen, forcing me back to the far wall. The window beside me burst inward, where more of Mendax's troops slipped inside. "Oh, come on! Slow is smooth, smooth is fast," I said to myself, striking a second match. The tip held and combusted. Someone grabbed hold of my shirt from behind as I lit the candle clutched in the long dead hand. It spit and sputtered before blazing to life. The crowd froze. I tore myself away from the mob's grip, picking my way between all the bodies packed in the small room, their glinting eyes following as I passed. "You will serve those loyal to me," the man with the wireframe glasses said from over my shoulder. Mendax spoke through them, moving from person to person like a virus. I closed my eyes and took a deep breath. "Banish evil," I said, holding the intention in my mind. The slowly burning herbs filled the kitchen with their pleasant odor, causing the crowd to shudder violently in response. I sat the morbid candle holder on the counter near the door, then grabbed several brown glass bottles from the cupboard. A heavy black miasma streamed from the eyes of the townsfolk, curling and coiling from their bodies, until a smoky figure reformed at the center of the kitchen. 2 silver eyes shone from within the churning mist. The people lowered their gaze in reverence of their deity that stood before them. "You will serve my followers." The voice was calm and ancient. I smiled, then held up one of the brown glass bottles marked alcohol Nana used for tinctures. "Yeah? What if you don't have any followers?" I smashed the bottles on the ground, then quickly lit a match and tossed it into the puddle spreading across the kitchen floor. Screaming erupted behind me as I fled the house to the front lawn, where I watched the flames consume my childhood home and the paralyzed residents of Liar's Fane. I walked away from the smoldering ruins, with the thick scent of herbs and roasting flesh hanging in the air. The moon was high overhead by the time I reached the junction road leading to the highway, where a young woman in a passing car stopped to offer me a ride. I gladly accepted, sinking into the passenger seat, exhausted, eventually falling into a deep sleep. I woke to the sound of rain pattering the car's roof and windows. The woman in the driver's seat put the car in park and turned off the engine. "You sleep okay?" she said. "Yeah, thanks. I really appreciate the ride." I pulled the lever and brought my reclined seat upright to see out the window. My breath caught in my throat, dislodging as the primal sound of a trapped and terrified animal. Outside the window, in the cool morning rain, the farmhouse stood as it always had, amidst the corn and wheat, unmarred by flame.
"It's no trouble. I was headed this way anyway,"
the woman said, winking one silvery eye.
I keep hearing them crackling. I can't see them, but I hear them. At first I thought it was just a distant wolf howling, or my imagination playing up, but now I'm certain that they're here, somewhere amid the trees. Maybe watching me, maybe not, but aware of me nonetheless. Them hags are aware of everything that goes on in these woods, and I love them for it, in spite of myself. Their presence makes these nightly camping excursions more interesting. I'll give 'em that, but I wish I could drag my nice soft bed out here with me. Sleeping on the rooty ground with nothing but a few woolly blankets and a little tarp tent gets really old really fast. One day, the devil will take me for the things I do for the girls. Until then, my aching body will do the complaining every morning. I played out most of my life in these woods, alongside the things that dwell within it. I lived in fascinated fear of them most of my life, which is funny, considering that I started out being enchanted by them. Bone truth is, deep down, I miss them in a strange way. I think about them every day and wonder what would have become of me had I stayed on with them. I suppose it's only natural. Man's a curious creature. I knew they were running around in the woods since I was a boy growing up in a rickety wood cabin on the edge of the trees. We had a small farm consisting of 1 donkey, 10 chickens, 2 goats, and a cow. We also had a big old hound dog who couldn't herd for nothing, but was a darn good watchdog. If anybody came anywhere near the house, old Hank would start barking like he was possessed. Hank saw them before I did, or sensed them anyway. As far back as I can remember, Hank would stand guard right on the edge of the woods line. He'd stare real fixedly and snarl and growl. Not at just nighttime either. Even in broad daylight, he couldn't look into the forest without being on high alert. I reckon they were sneaking around even then. Probably had been for over a century by that stage. But I only recall seeing glimpses of them here and there. My very first recollection is seeing one staring out at me from behind a tree. She was old, withered, and raggedy, and sharp-faced, glaring at me with cold black eyes. I screamed and cried for my mama, and she reassured me that it had just been my imagination. We were on our own out there. We had no neighbors, and town was about an hour's walk each way. Surely there couldn't possibly be no woman in the woods. Mama then turned all angry on my pa and blamed him for telling me the story of Hansel and Gretel and the scary old witch. She said he'd put ideas in my head. Truthfully, he just allowed me to put a name to what I'd been seeing long before I ever heard that old fairy tale. Witches. Them things in the woods were witches. Back then, I didn't know exactly where the coven lived, but I knew they wasn't far away, and they had a real fascination with our farm. We'd often lose chickens during the night. Mostly, they just disappeared, but a few times, later on especially, some blood and feathers would be left behind, as if in ritual. Pa said it was foxes, but he never sounded none too convinced of that. Looking back, I reckon my father was well aware that bad things lurked in those woods. My mama did, too. She'd get all jittery if we was outside, and she heard as much as a twig snap. I don't know if she ever got a glimpse of one, but she never missed as much as one Sunday church sermon. I suppose all that praying was her way of seeking protection from a threat that she couldn't describe or explain. My folks might have had their suspicions, but they ain't never said nothing to me. Of course, they didn't have to say anything to me. I knew more than anyone else because I'd seen more than anybody. Those hags had a fancy for me from day one. They was always lurking around the woods, but when I was 5, they got bolder and started staring at me at the window. If I had the poor luck of waking up in the middle of the night, I'd get a nasty shock when I looked over at the window to see several of those raggedy women staring in at me, grinning. I woke up screaming more nights than I can count. Mama blamed the fairy tales, but I knew them women were as real as the moon. The old hags could move fast, too. They were always away from the window when my pa and Mama burst into my room. To be honest, not all of them were hags. Some of them were young, and later several were beautiful, which is really how the whole mess started in the first place. Occasionally, they seemed kind and friendly, more akin to angels than witches. I was about 4 the first time I really took notice of the one who called herself Blythe. She looked to be only a few years older than me, and she had a soft smile. At night, she'd come to the window closest to my bed. She always seemed to know when I couldn't sleep. And we'd make funny faces at each other, she standing outside and me lying in bed, until I got sleepy enough to doze off. Sometimes she'd hum lullabies to me, just loud enough for me to hear, but she never woke my folks. I liked being an only child, and when I found out my mama was expecting, I was none too pleased. I went up to the window the night I found out, and I tearfully told Blythe about how I didn't want no brother or sister. She nodded at me with sympathy in her eyes and took my hand in hers. She listened close, even though she didn't say anything. Blythe was as quiet as a spider. I was elated a little while later to hear I wasn't going to have none, although I was sorry to see Mama laid up in bed crying. I understand now that she had, and then kept having, miscarriages, and she didn't know why, although I did. I willed it, without even understanding that I had done so. I was 12, going on 13, when the Civil War started. I was too young to get called up, and my pa was too old, so we just continued life as if nothing was wrong. Our neck of the woods saw no fighting, and the soldiers didn't descend on our little town neither. I suppose you could say it was real lucky, or we had a little extra protection. As the war raged on around us, near but distant, boys only a little older than me was losing their lives every day. As for me, I kept my life, but gave my soul to something much worse than soldiers. Blythe was the start of it, of course, as I always knew she'd be. Her visits to me had become more frequent, and they wasn't only confined to the nighttime anymore. It had started when she took to peeking at me from the woods in broad daylight as I did my daily chores. Now, they'd always been there, creeping and peeking. But Blythe got close. She wanted me to know she was there. Hell, she was my friend. I was about 7 when our kinship initially started up, and over the course of the following 5 years, we took to playing hide-and-seek and tag whenever I could sneak away. As usual, Blythe never spoke a word. I don't think she could. Her sisters, I suppose that's as good a thing to call them as any, could speak, rave even, in my language, and tongues far older. But Blythe was mute. She was also beautiful, and seemed to grow up right with me, except lovelier and lovelier the older I got. When I was 12, I started to notice her piercing blue eyes, jet black hair, and magenta lips with increasing interest. She was lithe, yet curvy in all the right places. When I was 13, I went down to the river to get some washing water from my mama, who was having one of her bad spells, a day when she did nothing but lie around the house. That happened more and more after she started losing all the babies. Anyway, while I was down at the water, Blythe crept out of the woods. I smiled at her, thinking she was just going to stand on the shore and stare at me like she so often did. She never helped me with the chores, but instead she descended into the water, way past her knees up to her thighs. In the process of doing so, she lifted her skirt high enough to give me a full view of her long legs. I stared, and she stopped and looked right at me. She smiled coyly, and then she giggled. which was the most noise I'd ever heard her make, when she wasn't humming some strange tune, splashed some water in my direction and darted off back into the woods, leaving me standing there by my lonesome and wishing, yearning, for more of her legs and laugh and company. I saw her again 2 days later, and that's when she offered me the apple. A rare sort of red, savory, and juicy. I can still feel it on my lips. I suppose that was the day of my indoctrination, since my absolute obsession with Blythe had started then. Thought about her constantly, even dreamt about her, and as if she knew it, she started getting flirtier with me. She would still meet me in the woods to play like we had when we was kids, or when I was a kid and she looked like a kid, but she started flashing her legs at me more. Well, at first it was her legs, but over time she let me catch flashes of other more intimate parts of her too. Always from a distance, mind you. She wouldn't ever stand still long enough to let me touch her, not as if I'd have the nerve to begin with, mind you, but she'd taken to touching me whenever she could. She'd jump out at me from behind the trees and stroke my hair, or run her palm down my chest, which drove me wild even with my shirt on. And she even reached out and squeezed my leg on occasions when we were sitting next to each other. If I tried to touch her, she'd stand up and run off into the woods, giggling like the tease she was. She was driving me crazy, and it only got worse when she started bringing her friends, or sisters, or whatever the hell they were, with her. One was more succulent than the next. There was the busty blonde named Anne, who wasn't shy about complimenting me and looking me over in a way that made my heart hammer in my chest. Joan was a brunette with black eyes that were as pretty as Blythe's blues, and she was the really touchy-feely one. No matter how much they surrounded me and fawned over me and had fed me impossibly fresh apples and grapes, they never let me get too comfortable, and they never let things go as far as I wanted. And whenever we was out in the woods together, I'd always spy other shapes creeping about, the old ones lurking. I suppose they were spying on us, making sure all went according to plan. I'd become so enthralled by the woods that I started neglecting my chores. On a few occasions, I'd wander home late, and my pa had given me a heck of a belting, while my mama screamed and cried and begged him to stop. She was disturbed by how thin I'd grown. I hadn't been eating on the regular. My only appetite at the time had nothing to do with food. Hank, the dog, went first. My pa and I found him all ripped up on the edge of our farm. My pa thought it was a fox, but I thought the slashes looked more like claws or talons, like a lady's fingernails more than teeth. I can't say I was angry. I couldn't prove them women of the woods had anything to do with the old dog's death, and it was one less mouth to feed. My father went next, then my mother. Both were taken by fever. They came down sick without me noticing too much at first. I was mighty distracted most days, after all. But when I saw them sicking up and feverish, I instantly ran to the woods. I screamed for Blythe and the others, and I begged them for help. I somehow knew they could make potions, yet I was just calling into the trees. No one came. I thought I'd been forsaken, and walked home feeling sick and panicky, only to find a pretty green glass bottle at my door. Relief washed over me like rainwater. See, I still loved my folks dearly, and I would have done anything to save them. I made sure both my parents drank from the bottle, then I took a swig from it too. I don't know why I did. I wasn't ailing none, but it just seemed like a good idea at the time. It was sweet, yet it had a sharp aftertaste. I ain't never tasted nothing like it before or since, but I ain't never forgot it or what it did. As soon as I swallowed it down, I felt completely relaxed and at peace with everything, which is pretty goddamn weird, considering both my parents were dying, but I slept like a baby that night. Within a fortnight, both my folks had passed on, but I didn't cry or make any fuss at all. It's like I was incapable of feeling sadness. I calmly walked outside in the light of day and started digging 2 graves. I had no desire to alert the town or set up a church mass. My parents had been happy living on that farm for nearly 2 decades, and they'd be happy staying there for eternity. As I was digging, I heard branches crack behind me. I turned around and saw Blythe standing there, her big eyes looking at me not with sympathy, but with a kind of longing, a yearning that I had never seen in her before. Anne and Joan followed close behind her, and all 3 of them helped me finish the burials and mark the graves with rocks. Then Blythe, who was still my favorite of all, took my hand and pulled me into the woods with Joan and Anne following. Then, too, was giggling, but Blythe was just smiling. Back then I thought her grin was soft and sweet, but looking back now, I realized that there was something wolfish right under the surface. That was the day my life either began or ended, depending on how you look at it. It was certainly when things got weird, though. Blythe led me by hand through the woods to a cabin that was nestled between a grove of trees and a mountain rock. They took me inside and gave me another sip of something, this time out of a blue bottle that sent my head spinning in the nicest possible way. They led me to a tub of nice warm water, which was a rarity back when I was 16, and all 3 of the young ones stripped me naked before scrubbing me down with fresh soap, getting all the dirt and grime off of my skin and out of my hair. Blythe was just smiling, but Anne and Joan were commenting on how nice and muscular I was. After my bath, they dried me off with a towel as soft as velvet and led me to a nice soft bed. Each one of them took turns making me a man. I was happy Blythe went first, because she was special, although as I watched her face contort in pleasure, I couldn't help but notice that it was changing, altering. At times it looked like she was about 1,000 years old, which should have disturbed me, but I was too wrapped up in euphoria to startle. And that's how things went for some unknown length of time. I stayed lying in that bed all day, drinking their portions and eating their food, sleeping soundly entwined in their plush blankets, with my head resting on their soft pillows, and making love to the young ones every night. At first it was just Blythe and Anne and Joan, but then there were others. I couldn't keep track of anything, and I didn't care that I couldn't. I was aware of the older woman being around. They looked like hags, but they cooked well and didn't try to mess with me, so I didn't mind them. Occasionally I had a nightmare about sharp-toothed, gaping-mawed demon women chasing me through the trees, and I'd wake up in a cold sweat, startling all the girls, coven, lying around me. Then they'd give me a swig of one of their potions, and it would go all away, and all would be well again. Occasionally, I'd come out of my pleasure stupor enough to notice that some of the girls' bellies were extending, swelling like pumpkins in autumn in a way that could only mean pregnancy. They were growing my children inside of them. That realization initially horrified me so much that I physically recoiled and let out a little scream. They laughed and surrounded me and let me feel their bellies. Something was moving inside them, but it felt more like a festering nest of ants than a baby, as they poured more of that sweet potion down my throat and sent my hazy head back into oblivion. As blissfully out of it as I was back then, there are some things I recall. I suppose the war was still going on, because I'd occasionally hear the sound of lost soldiers roaming around the woods. The ladies would throw a blanket over me to keep me, their treasure, warm and hidden, safe. Before leaving the cabin, I'd sometimes just be able to make out vague voices, conversations that went from chatter to panic to screaming. Afterwards, the ladies would use the scraps of their uniforms to sew themselves new dresses, and prettying the garments up with shiny brass buttons and the occasional ring. And one of the old hags could cook up a nice meaty stew and share some with me. Over the years, I can't count how many times I've had a hankering to taste that delicious meal again. Other times, I'd hear babies crying or gurgling. Some sounded right, like what I assumed a human child should sound like, and others didn't. The crying always stopped, sometimes by itself, sometimes after I heard a good, hard, sickening thud, but it always stopped eventually. Then I'd see the ladies busying themselves around the cauldron, brewing up a skin cream that made them all look younger, fresher, even the old ones. Other times I'd catch glimpses of the women nursing babies at their bosoms. Anne and Joan used to do it right in front of me, but they would never let me see the my children's, faces. I got a feeling they kept the girls only. They was replenishing the coven. I have no idea how long their kind lives, because I'm now certain that there ain't nothing human about them. But some of the older ones had to be close to the end. Perhaps that's why they needed me. Blythe's belly never grew. Even though she visited me in the bed most often and most tenderly, she never grew my seed. I've no idea why that still makes me a little sad, given the horror of what was happening to those, my, young'uns, but it does. Blythe's special to me, always will be. A few times a year, which I now reckon to be the 2 equinoxes and solstices, they'd leave the cabin and descend into the woods. I was so curious one night that I decided to follow them. I had to gather my strength to get out of the bed, and my legs and feet felt cramped and sore since I hadn't been walking in a while. I spied them just beyond the tree grove, all of them dancing stark naked around a big bonfire. I wasn't able to take my eyes off them, even though I was scared that they was going to see me and get mad and crack my skull open like they'd done to most of the babes. Yet after about an hour, Blythe did spot me and did nothing but smile. Later, they all led me back to the cabin, and Blythe loved me to sleep while Anne and Joan lounged nearby, lulling a sweet song in a language that only their kind could understand. And so that's how it was for years, maybe as long as a decade or more. I lived every young man's fantasy and probably would have kept on doing it if they hadn't evicted me. It wasn't as harsh as it sounds. I always figured that when they got tired of me, they'd simply kill me and eat me like they did to the soldiers, and the occasional band of runaway slaves who had the misfortune of crossing the cabin's path. Yet Blythe had other ideas, although she never spoke. She was somehow the most commanding of them. Hell, for all I know, she's the oldest, and is just real good at masking it. One day, when I was a grown man, with a full beard and fuller belly, she dressed me and helped me off the bed and led me out of the cabin. We walked hand in hand out of the woods, in much the same way that we'd walked into it so many years before. She brought me back to my childhood home. My parents' graves were overgrown, the stones covered in moss, and the barn was barely standing, but a rush of memories came at me nonetheless. I told her I didn't want to stay here. I begged her to go back to the coven, and the warmth of her body. But she shook her head firmly. She handed me a pouch full of sand, or what normal folks would mistake for sand, and pointed outward toward the farm and the trees and what lay beyond. Without one word uttered, I'd been given my instructions, assigned my fate. I would have compiled regardless, but I'm mighty glad that she saw fit to give me one final intimate kiss before she slipped back into the woods and disappeared among the trees. It was strange going back to town. A lot had changed, and most folks didn't know me or assumed I was a hobo or a drifter. I hadn't shaved in a while. Pa had been poor, but a savvy one, and he had saved some coins in a mason jar that he'd buried under the porch. I dug it up and had just enough in the pocket to get a wash and a shave, some food, and a paper. The old feller behind the counter at the general store seemed to recognize me, although he didn't say nothing. It took me a moment to recognize him, since when I had been there last, he was a man of 30 or so, and now he looked like a granddaddy. I sure as heck ain't aged that much. Whatever the girls put into those potions clearly worked. The paper said there'd been a war, not the Civil War, but another one, and now a third was brewing. The country was in trouble, everybody was poor. Money men in New York City were jumping out of windows, and out west there was some awful freak of nature going on called the Dust Bowl. It sounded more like a hex or a spell than anything natural, but of course I didn't say that to nobody. In fact, I didn't say one word to nobody then, and haven't much since. I'm sure my conversation skills are well and truly lacking. With my foray into town over, I went back to the farm and spread the sand, ground baby bones, all over the edges of my property. I knew damn well it was a protection spell, a long-lasting one at that. I saw how the world was changing when I went into my once sleepy village. People riding around on machines rather than horses, and women wearing outfits that showed off more of their physiques than my mama would have thought proper. And the town was bigger, a lot bigger, than it had been when I was a boy. It's only a matter of time before more people come, and then folks start walking around those woods. And Blythe knew it. We can't let nobody find him, or me. I'll start fixing up my homestead, although I reckon I'm about 8 decades old. I don't feel or look more than 35 or so. I can do it. The work will put muscles on me, just the way they like it. If the coven needs a place to run to, sanctuary, I can provide such safety. And it's not just because if I fail, they'll tear me limb from limb and use my parts for potions, which they would, but that's beside the point. There's a reason I built that old farmstead back up. There's a cause behind me camping out yonder every night just to hear the cold comfort of their calls and rustlings. There's a method behind my unending diligence to their preservation. I protect them because that's what patriarchs do. Thank you so much for taking time out of your day to listen to this story in its entirety. If you've enjoyed what you've heard and would like to support me and my efforts, hit the like button and do not forget to subscribe and turn on notifications today. And please share this video with everyone on your social media. With just a few clicks, you can help this channel grow and reach new listeners. You can also support me by subscribing to my podcast, Scary Stories Told in the Dark, with dozens of episodes available now. Visit simplyscarypodcast.com for more details today. For exclusive, ad-free extended episodes of my program, including stories you won't find here on YouTube, visit chillingtalesfordarknights.com/join and sign up as a patron today, or pick up a season pass for my show. Lastly, if you'd like to contribute directly, you can support me with donations at patreon.com. Just visit patreon.com/Otis Jiry. That's patreon.com/OTISJIRY. Thanks again for listening and for your support. Have a great day, and God bless you.
tales for